Chapter 20 of the Prairie by James Fenimore Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Peck.
Welcome, ancient pistol. Shakespeare.
It was not long before the trapper pointed out the commanding person of Prairie as the leader of the Sioux. This chief, who had been among the last to obey the vociferous summons of Weucha, no sooner reached the spot where his whole party was now gathered, than he threw himself from his horse, and proceeded to examine the marks of the extraordinary trail with that degree of dignity and attention which became his high and responsible station. The warriors, for it was but too evident that they were to a man of that fearless and ruthless class, awaited the result of his investigation with patient reserve. None but a few of the principal braves presuming even to speak, while their leader was thus gravely occupied. It was several minutes before Prairie seemed satisfied. He then directed his eyes along the ground to those several places where Ishmael had found the same revolting evidences of the passage of some bloody struggle, and motioned to his people to follow. The whole band advanced in a body towards the thicket, until they came to a halt within a few yards of the precise spot where Esther had stimulated her sluggish sons to break into the cover. The reader will readily imagine that the trapper and his companions were not indifferent observers to so threatening a movement. The old man summoned all who were capable of bearing arms to his side, and demanded in very unequivocal terms, though in a voice that was suitably lowered, in order to escape the ears of their dangerous neighbours, whether they were disposed to make a battle for their liberty, or whether they should try the milder expedient of conciliation. As it was a subject in which all had an equal interest, he put the question as to the council of war, not without some slight exhibition of the lingering vestiges of a nearly extinct military pride. Paul and the Doctor were diametrically opposed to each other in opinion, the former declaring for an immediate appeal to arms, and the latter was warmly espousing the policy of pacific measures. Middleton, who saw that there was great danger of a hot verbal dispute between two men, who were governed by feelings so diametrically opposed, saw fit to assume the office of arbiter, or rather to decide the question, his situation making him a sort of umpire. He also leaned to the side of peace, for he evidently saw that, in consequence of the vast superiority of their enemies, violence would irretrievably lead to their destruction. The trapper listened to the reasons of the young soldier with great attention, and, as they were given with the steadiness of one who did not suffer apprehension to blind his judgment, they did not fail to produce a suitable impression. "It is rational," rejoined the trapper, when the other had delivered his reasons. "It is very rational, for what man cannot move his strength he must circumvent with his wits. It is reason that makes him stronger than the buffaloe, and swifter than the moose. Now stay you here, and keep yourselves close. My life and my traps are but little value, when the welfare of so many human souls are concerned. And, moreover, I may say that I know the windings of Indian cunning. Therefore will I go alone upon the prairie. It may so happen that I can yet draw the eyes of a Sioux from this spot, and give you time and room to fly." As if resolved to listen to no remonstrance, the old man quietly shouldered his rifle, and moving leisurely through the thicket, he issued on the plain, at a point whence he might first appear before the eyes of the Sioux, without exciting their suspicions that he came from its cover. The instant that the figure of a man, dressed in the garb of a hunter, and bearing the well-known and much dreaded rifle, appeared before the eyes of the Sioux, there was a sensible though a suppressed sensation in the band. The artifice of the trapper had so far succeeded, as to render it extremely doubtful whether he came from some point on the open prairie, or from the thicket, though the Indians still continued to cast frequent and suspicious glances at the cover. They had made their halt at the distance of an arrow flight from the bushes, but when the stranger came sufficiently nigh to show that the deep coating of red and brown, which time and exposure had given to his features, was laid upon the original colour of a pale-face, they slowly receded from the spot, until they reached a distance that might defeat the aim of firearms. In the meantime the old man continued to advance, until he had got nigh enough to make himself heard without difficulty. Here he stopped, and dropping his rifle to the earth, he raised his hand with the palm outward, in a token of peace. After uttering a few words of reproach to his hound, who watched the savage group with eyes that seemed to recognize them, he spoke in the Sioux tongue. "My brothers are welcome," he said, cunningly constituting himself the master of the region in which they had met, and assuming the offices of hospitality. "They are far from their villages, and are hungry. Will they follow to my lodge to eat and sleep?" No sooner was his voice heard, than the yell of pleasure, which burst from a dozen mouths, convinced the sagacious trapper that he also was recognized. Feeling that it was too late to retreat, he profited by the confusion which prevailed among them, while Weucha was explaining his character, to advance until he was again face to face with the redoubtable Mahtoree. The second interview between these two men, each of whom was extraordinary in his way, was marked by the usual caution of the frontiers. They stood for nearly a minute, examining each other without speaking. "Where are your young men?" sternly demanded the Teton chieftain, after he found that the immovable features of the trapper refused to betray any of their master's secrets under his intimidating look. "The Long knives do not come in bands to trap the beaver. I am alone." "Your head is white, but you have a forked tongue. Mahtoree has been in your camp. He knows that you are not alone. Where is your young wife, and the warrior that I found upon the prairie?" "I have no wife. I have told my brother that the woman and her friend were strangers. The words of a grey head should be heard, and not forgotten. The Dahcotahs found travellers asleep, and they thought they had no need of horses. The women and children of a Pale face are not used to go far on foot. Let them be sought where you left them." The eyes of the Teton flashed fire as he answered, "They are gone. But Mahtoree is a wise chief, and his eyes can see a great distance." "Does the partisan of the Tetons see men on these naked fields?" retorted the trapper, with great steadiness of mien. "I am very old, and my eyes grow dim. Where do they stand?" The chief remained silent a moment, as if he disdained to contest any further the truth of a fact, concerning which he was already satisfied. Then, pointing to the traces of the earth, he said, with a sudden transition to mildness in his eye and manner— "My father has learnt wisdom in many winters. Can he tell me whose moccasin has left this trail?" "There have been wolves and buffaloes on the prairies, and there may have been cougars too." Mahtoree glanced his eye at the thicket, as if he thought the latter suggestion not impossible. Pointing to the place, he ordered his young men to reconnoitre it more closely, cautioning them at the same time, with a stern look at the trapper, to beware of treachery from the Big knives. 3 or 4 half-naked, eager-looking youths lashed their horses at the word, and darted away to obey the mandate. The old man trembled a little for the discretion of Paul, when he saw this demonstration. The Tetons encircled the place 2 or 3 times, approaching nigher and nigher at each circuit, and then galloped back to their leader to report that the copse seemed empty. Notwithstanding the trapper watched the eye of Mahtoree, to detect the inward movements of his mind, and if possible to anticipate, in order to direct his suspicions, the utmost sagacity of one so long accustomed to study the cold habits of the Indian race, could however detect no symptom or expression that denoted how far he credited or distrusted this intelligence. Instead of replying to the information of his scouts, he spoke kindly to his horse, and motioning to a youth to receive the bridle, or rather halter, by which he governed the animal, he took the trapper by the arm, and led him a little apart from the rest of the band. "Has my brother been a warrior?" said the wily Teton, in a tone that he intended should be conciliating. "Do the leaves cover the trees in the season of fruits? Go. The Dahcotahs have not seen as many warriors living as I have looked on in their blood. But what signifies idle remembrancing," he added in English, "when limbs grow stiff, and sight is failing?" The chief regarded him a moment with a severe look, as if he would lay bare the falsehood he had heard, but meeting in the calm eye and steady mien of the trapper a confirmation of the truth of what he said, he took the hand of the old man, and laid it gently on his head, in token of the respect that was due to the other's years and experience. "Why then do the Big knives tell their red brethren to bury the tomahawk?" he said, when their own young men never forget that they are braves, and meet each other so often with bloody hands." "My nation is more numerous than the buffaloes on the prairies, or the pigeons in the air. Their quarrels are frequent, yet their warriors are few. None go out on the war-path, but they who are gifted with the qualities of a brave, and therefore such see many battles." "It is not so. My father is mistaken," returned Mahtoree, indulging in a smile of exulting penetration, at the very instant he corrected the force of his denial, in deference to the years and services of one so aged. "The Big knives are very wise, and they are men. All of them would be warriors. They would leave the redskins to dig roots and hoe the corn. But a Dahcotah is not born to live like a woman. He must strike the Pawnee and the Omaha, or he will lose the name of his fathers. The Master of Life looks with an open eye on his children, who die in a battle that is fought for the right. But he is blind, and his ears are shut to the cries of an Indian, who is killed when plundering, or doing evil to his neighbour." "My father is old," said Mahtoree, looking at his aged companion, with an expression of irony, that sufficiently denoted he was one of those who overstep the trammels of education, and who are perhaps a little given to abuse the mental liberty they thus obtain. "He is very old. Has he made a journey to the far country? And has he been at the trouble to come back to tell the young men what he has seen?" "Teton," returned the trapper, throwing the breech of his rifle to the earth with startling vehemence, and regarding his companion with steady serenity, "I have heard that there are men, among my people, who study their great medicines until they believe themselves to be gods, and who laugh at all faith except in their own vanities. It may be true, it is true, for I have seen them. When man is shut up in towns and schools, with his own follies, it may be easy to believe himself greater than the Master of Life. But a warrior, who lives in a house with the clouds for its roof, where he can at any moment look at both the heavens and at the earth, and who daily sees the power of the Great Spirit, should be more humble. A Dahcotah chieftain ought to be too wise to laugh at justice." The crafty Mahtoree, who saw that his free thinking was not likely to produce a favourable impression on the old man, instantly changed his ground, by alluding to the more immediate subject of their interview. Laying his hand gently on the shoulder of the trapper, he led him forward, until they both stood within 50 feet of the margin of the thicket. Here he fastened his penetrating eyes on the other's honest countenance, and continued the discourse. "If my father has hid his young men in the bush, let him tell them to come forth. You see that a Dahcotah is not afraid. Mahtoree is a great chief. A warrior, whose head is white, and who is about to go to the land of spirits, cannot have a tongue with two ends, like a serpent." "Dahcotah, I have told no lie. Since the Great Spirit made me a man, I have lived in the wilderness, or on these naked plains, without lodge or family. I am a hunter, and go on my path alone." "My father has a good carbine. Let him point it in the bush, and fire." The old man hesitated a moment, and then slowly prepared himself to give this delicate assurance of the truth of what he said, without which he plainly perceived the suspicions of his crafty companion could not be lulled. As he lowered his rifle, his eye, although greatly dimmed and weakened by age, ran over the confused collection of objects that lay embedded amid the party-coloured foliage of the thicket, until it succeeded in catching a glimpse of the brown covering of the stem of a small tree. With this object in view, he raised the piece to a level, and fired. The bullet had no sooner glided from the barrel than a tremor seized the hands of the trapper, which, had it occurred a moment sooner, would have utterly disqualified him for so hazardous an experiment. A frightful silence succeeded the report, during which he expected to hear the shrieks of the females, and then, as the smoke whirled away in the wind, he caught a view of the fluttering bark, and felt assured that all his former skill was not entirely departed from him. Dropping the piece to the earth, he turned again to his companion, with an air of the utmost composure, and demanded— "Is my brother satisfied?" "Mahtoree is a chief of the Dahcotahs," returned the cunning Teton, laying his hand on his chest in acknowledgment of the other's sincerity. He knows that a warrior, who has smoked at so many council fires, until his head has grown white, would not be found in wicked company. But did not my father once ride on a horse, like a rich chief of the Pale faces, instead of travelling on foot like a hungry Konza?" "Never. The Wakanda has given me legs, and he has given me resolution to use them. For 60 summers and winters did I journey in the woods of America, and 10 tiresome years have I dwelt on these open fields, without finding need to call often upon the gifts of the other creatures of the Lord to carry me from place to place." "If my father has so long lived in the shade, why has he come upon the prairies? The sun will scorch him." The old man looked sorrowfully about for a moment, and then turning with a confidential air to the other, he replied— "I passed the spring, summer, and autumn of life among the trees. The winter of my days had come, and found me where I loved to be, in the quiet, ay, and in the honesty of the woods. Teton, then I slept happily, where my eyes could look up through the branches of the pines and the beeches, to the very dwelling of the good spirit of my people. If I had need to open my heart to him, while his fires were burning above my head, the door was open and before my eyes. But the axes of the choppers awoke me. For a long time my ears heard nothing but the uproar of clearings. I bore it like a warrior and a man. There was a reason that I should bear it, but when that reason was ended, I bethought me to get beyond the accursed sounds. It was tying to the courage and to the habits, but I had heard of these vast and naked fields, and I came hither to escape the wasteful temper of my people. Tell me, Dahcotah, have I not done well?" The trapper laid his long, lean finger on the naked shoulder of the Indian as he ended, and seemed to demand his felicitations on his ingenuity and success, with a ghastly smile, in which triumph was singularly blended with regret. His companion listened intently, and replied to the question by saying, in sententious manner of his race— "The head of my father is very grey. He has always lived with men, and he has seen everything. What he does is good, what he speaks is wise. Now, let him say, is he sure that he is a stranger to the Big knives, who are looking for their beasts on every side of the prairies, and cannot find them?" "Dahcotah, what I have said is true. I live alone, and never do I mingle with men whose skins are white, if—" His mouth was suddenly closed by an interruption that was as mortifying as it was unexpected. The words were still on his tongue, when the bushes on the side of the thicket where they stood, opened, and the whole of the party whom he had just left, and in whose behalf he was endeavouring to reconcile his love of truth to the necessity of prevaricating, came openly into view. A pause of mute astonishment succeeded this unlooked-for spectacle. Then Mahtoree, who did not suffer a muscle or a joint to betray the wonder and surprise he actually experienced, motioned towards the advancing friends of the trapper with an air of assumed civility, and a smile that lighted his fierce, dark visage, as the glare of the setting sun reveals the volume and load of the cloud, that is charged to bursting with the electric fluid. He however disdained to speak, or to give any other evidence of his intentions than by calling to his side the distant band, who sprang forward at his beck, with the alacrity of willing subordinates. In the meantime the friends of the old man continued to advance. Middleton himself was foremost, supporting the light and aerial-looking figure of Inez, on whose anxious countenance he cast such occasional glances of tender interest as, in similar circumstances, a father would have given to his child. Paul led Ellen, close in their rear, but while the eye of the bee-hunter did not neglect his blooming companion, it scowled angrily, resembling more the aspect of the sullen and retreating bear than the soft intelligence of a favoured suitor. Obed and Asinus came last, the former leading his companion with a degree of fondness that could hardly be said to be exceeded by any other of the party. The approach of the naturalist was far less rapid than that of those who preceded him. His feet seemed equally reluctant to advance or to remain stationary, his position bearing a great analogy to that of Mahomet's coffin, with the exception that the quality of repulsion, rather than that of attraction, held him in a state of rest. The repulsive power in his rear, however, appeared to predominate, and by a singular exception, as he would have said himself, to all philosophical principles, it rather increased than diminished by distance. As the eyes of the naturalist steadily maintained a position that was the opposite of his route, they served to give a direction to those of the observers of all these movements, and at once furnished a sufficient clue by which to unravel the mystery of so sudden a debouchement from the cover. Another cluster of stout and armed men was seen at no great distance, just rounding a point of the thicket, and moving directly, though cautiously, towards the place where the band of Sioux was posted, as a squadron of cruisers is often seen to steer across the waste of waters towards the rich but well-protected convoy. In short, the family of the squatter, or at least such among them as were capable of bearing arms, appeared in view, on the broad prairie, evidently bent on revenging their wrongs. Mahtoree and his party slowly retired from the thicket, the moment they caught a view of the strangers, until they halted on a swell that commanded a wide and unobstructed view of the naked fields on which they stood. Here the Dahcotah appeared disposed to make his stand, and to bring matters to an issue. Notwithstanding this retreat, in which he compelled the trapper to accompany him, Middleton still advanced, until he too halted on the same elevation, and within speaking distance of the warlike Sioux. The borderers, in their turn, took a favourable position, though at a much greater distance. The three groups now resembled so many fleets at sea, lying with their topsails to the mast, with the commendable precaution of reconnoitring, before each could ascertain who among the strangers might be considered as friends, and who as foes. During this moment of suspense, the dark, threatening eye of Mahtoree rolled from one of the strange parties to the other, in keen and hasty examination, and then it turned its withering look on the old man, as the chief said, in a tone of high and bitter scorn— "The Big knives are fools! It is easier to catch the cougar asleep than to find a blind Dahcotah. Did the whitehead think to ride on the horse of a Sioux?" The trapper, who had found time to collect his perplexed faculties, saw at once that Middleton, having perceived Ishmael on the trail by which they had fled, preferred trusting to the hospitality of the savages than to the treatment he would be likely to receive from the hands of the squatter. He therefore disposed himself to clear the way for the favourable reception of his friends, since he found that the unnatural coalition became necessary to secure the liberty, if not the lives, of the party. "Did my brother ever go on a war-path to strike my people?" he calmly demanded of the indignant chief, who still awaited his reply. The lowering aspect of the Teton warrior so far lost its severity, as to suffer a gleam of pleasure and triumph to lighten its ferocity, as sweeping his arm in an entire circle around his person, he answered— "What tribe or nation has not felt the blows of Dahcotahs? Mahtoree is their partisan." "And has he found the Big knives women, or has he found them men?" A multitude of fierce passions were struggling in the tawny countenance of the Indian. For a moment, inextinguishable hatred seemed to hold the mastery, and then a nobler expression, and one that better became the character of a brave, got possession of his features, and maintained itself until, first throwing aside his light robe of pictured deerskin, and pointing to the scar of a bayonet in his breast, he replied— "It was given as it was taken, face to face." "It is enough. My brother is a brave chief, and he should be wise. Let him look. Is that a warrior of the Pale faces? Was it one such as that who gave the great Dahcotah his hurt?" The eyes of the Mahtoree followed the direction of the old man's extended arm, until they rested on the drooping form of Inez. The look of the Teton was long, riveted, and admiring. Like that of the young Pawnee, it resembled more the gaze of a mortal on some heavenly image, than the admiration with which man is wont to contemplate even the loveliness of a woman. Starting, as if suddenly self-convinced of forgetfulness, the chief next turned his eyes on Ellen, where they lingered an instant with a much more intelligible expression of admiration, and then pursued their course until they had taken another glance at each individual of the party. "My brother sees that my tongue is not forked," continued the trapper, watching the emotions the other betrayed with a readiness of comprehension little inferior to that of the Teton himself. "The Big knives do not send their women to war. I know that the Dahcotahs will smoke with the strangers." "Mahtoree is a great chief. The Big knives are welcome," said the Teton, laying his hand on his breast, with an air of lofty politeness that would have done credit to any state of society. "The arrows of my young men are in their quivers." The trapper motioned to Middleton to approach, and in a few moments the two parties were blended in one, each of the males having exchanged friendly greetings, after the fashions of the prairie warriors. But, even while engaged in this hospitable manner, the Dahcotah did not fail to keep a strict watch on the more distant party of white men, as if he still distrusted an artifice, or sought further explanation. The old man, in his turn, perceived the necessity of being more explicit, and of securing the slight and equivocal advantage he had already obtained. While affecting to examine the group, which still lingered at the spot where it had first halted, as if to discover the characters of those who composed it, he plainly saw that Ishmael contemplated immediate hostility. The result of a conflict on the open prairie, between a dozen resolute bordermen and the half-armed natives, even though seconded by their white allies, was in his experienced judgment a point of great uncertainty, and though far from reluctant to engage in the struggle on account of himself, the aged trapper thought it far more worthy of his years and his character to avoid than court the contest. His feelings were, for obvious reasons, in accordance with those of Paul and Middleton, who had lives still more precious than their own to watch over and protect. In this dilemma the three consulted on the means of escaping the frightful consequences which might immediately follow a single act of hostility on the part of the borderers. The old man taking care of their communication should, in the eyes of those, who noted the expression of their countenances with jealous watchfulness, bear the appearance of explanations as to the reason why such a party of travellers was met so far in the deserts. "I know that the Dahcotahs are a wise and great people," at length the trapper commenced, again addressing himself to the chief. "But does not their partisan know a single brother who is base?" The eye of Mahtoree wandered proudly around his band, but rested a moment reluctantly on Weucha, as he answered— "The Master of Life has made chiefs, and warriors, and women," conceiving that he thus embraced all the gradations of human excellence from the highest to the lowest. "And he has also made pale-faces who are wicked, such as they whom my brother sees yonder." "Do they go on foot to do wrong?" demanded the Teton, with a wild gleam from his eyes, that sufficiently betrayed how well he knew the reason why they were reduced to so humble an expedient. "Their beasts are gone, but their powder and their lead and their blankets remain." "Do they carry their riches in their hands, like miserable Konzas? Or are they brave, and leave them with the women, as men should do, who know where to find what they lose?" "My brother sees a spot of blue across the prairie. Look, the sun has touched it for the last time to-day." "Mahtoree is not a mole." "It is a rock. On it are the goods of the Big knives." An expression of savage joy shot into the dark countenance of the Teton as he listened. Turning to the old man, he seemed to read his soul, as if to assure himself he was not deceived. Then he bent his look on the party of Ishmael, and counted its number. "One warrior is wanting," he said. "Does my brother see the buzzards? There is his grave. Did he find blood on the prairie? It was his." "Enough! Mahtoree is a wise chief. Put your women on the horses of the Dahcotahs. We shall see, for our eyes are open very wide." The trapper wasted no unnecessary words in explanation. Familiar with the brevity and promptitude of the natives, he immediately communicated the result to his companions. Paul was mounted in an instant, with Ellen at his back. A few more moments were necessary to assure Middleton of the security and ease of Inez. While he was thus engaged, Mahtoree advanced to the side of the beast he had allotted to this service, which was his own, and manifested an intention to occupy his customary place on its back. The young soldier seized the reins of the animal, and glances of sudden anger and lofty pride were exchanged between them. "No man takes this seat but myself," said Middleton sternly in English. "Mahtoree is a great chief," retorted the savage, neither comprehending the meaning of the other's words. "The Dahcotah will be too late," whispered the old man at his elbow. "See, the Big knives are afraid, and they will soon run." The Teton chief instantly abandoned his claim, and threw himself on another horse, directing one of his young men to furnish a similar accommodation for the trapper. The warriors who were dismounted got up behind as many of their companions. Dr. Battius bestrode Asinus, and, notwithstanding the brief interruption, and half the time we have taken to relate it, the whole party was prepared to move. When he saw that all were ready, Mahtoree gave the signal to advance. A few of the best mounted of the warriors, the chief himself included, moved a little in front, and made a threatening demonstration, as if they intended to attack the strangers. The squatter, who was in truth slowly retiring, instantly halted his party, and showed a willing front. Instead, however, of coming within reach of the dangerous aim of the western rifle, the subtle savages kept wheeling about the strangers, until they had made a half circuit, keeping the latter in constant expectation of an assault. Then, perfectly secure of their object, the Tetons raised a loud shout, and darted across the prairie in a line for the distant rock, with the directness and nearly the velocity of the arrow that has just been shot from its bow. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of the Prairie by James Fenimore Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Peck. Dally not with the gods, but get thee gone. Shakespeare. Mahtoree had scarcely given the first intimation of his real design, before a general discharge from the borderers proved how well they understood it. The distance and the rapidity of the flight, however, rendered the fire harmless. As a proof how little he regarded the hostility of their party, the Dahcotah chieftain answered the report with a yell, and flourishing his carbine above his head, he made a circuit on the plain, followed by his chosen warriors, in scorn of the impotent attempt of his enemies. As the main body continued the direct course, this little band of the elite, in returning from its wild exhibition of savage contempt, took its place in the rear, with a dexterity and a concert of action that showed the manœuvre had been contemplated. Volley swiftly succeeded volley, until the enraged squatterer was reluctantly compelled to abandon the idea of injuring his enemies by means so feeble. Relinquishing his fruitless attempt, he commenced a rapid pursuit, occasionally discharging a rifle in order to give the alarm to the garrison, which he had prudently left under the command of the redoubtable Esther herself. In this manner the chase was continued for many minutes, the horsemen gradually gaining on their pursuers, who maintained the race, however, with an incredible power of foot. As the little speck of blue rose against the heavens, like an island issuing from the deep, the savages occasionally raised a yell of triumph. But the mists of evening were already gathering along the whole of the eastern margin of the prairie, and before the band had made half of the necessary distance, the dim outline of the rock had melted into the haze of the background. Indifferent to this circumstance, which rather favoured than disconcerted his plans, Mahtoree, who had again ridden in front, held on his course with the accuracy of a hound of the truest scent, merely slackening his speed a little, as the horses of his party were by this time thoroughly blown. It was at this stage of the enterprise that the old man rode up to the side of Middleton, and addressed him as follows in English. "Here is likely to be a thieving business, and one in which I must say I have but little wish to be a partner." "What would you do? It would be fatal to trust ourselves in the hands of the miscreants in our rear." "Tut for miscreants, be they red or be they white. Look ahead, lad, as if we were talking of our medicines, or perhaps praising the Teton beasts. For the knaves love to hear their horses commended, the same as a foolish mother in the settlements is fond of hearing the praises of her wilful child. So, pat the animal, and lay your hand on the gewgaws, with which the redskins have ornamented his mane, giving your eye, as it were, to one thing, and your mind to another. Listen. If matters are managed with judgment, we may leave these Tetons as the night sets in." "A blessed thought!" exclaimed Middleton, who retained the painful remembrance of the look of admiration with which Mahtoree had contemplated the loveliness of Inez, as well as of his subsequent presumption in daring to wish to take the office of her protector on himself. Lord, Lord, what a weak creature is man, when the gifts of nature are smothered in bookish knowledge and womanly manners! Such another start would tell these imps at our elbows that we were plotting against them, just as plainly as if it were whispered in their ears by a Sioux tongue. Ay, I know the devils. They look as innocent as so many frisky fawns, But there is not one among them all that has not an eye on our smallest motions. Therefore, what is to be done is to be done in wisdom, in order to circumvent their cunning. That is right. Pat his neck, and smile, as if you praised the horse, and keep the ear on my side open to my words. Be careful not to worry your beast, for though but little skilled in horses, reason teaches that breath is needful in a hard push, and that a weary leg makes a dull race. Be ready to mind the signal, when you hear a whine from old Hector. The first will be to make ready, the second to edge out of the crowd, and the third to go. Am I understood?"
"Perfectly, perfectly," said Middleton, trembling in his excessive eagerness to put the plan in instant execution, and pressing the little arm, which encircled his body, to his heart. "Perfectly. Hasten, hasten!"
"Ay, the beast is no sloth," continued the trapper, in the Teton language, as if he continued the discourse, edging cautiously through the dusky throng, at the same time, until he found himself riding at the side of Paul. He communicated his intentions in the same guarded manner as before. The high-spirited and fearless bee-hunter received the intelligence with delight, declaring his readiness to engage the whole of the savage band, should it become necessary to effect their object. When the old man drew off from the side of this pair also, he cast his eyes about him to discover the situation occupied by the naturalist. The Doctor, with infinite labour to himself and Asinus, had maintained a position in the very centre of the Sioux, so long as there existed the smallest reason for believing that any of the missiles of Ishmael might arrive in contact with his person. After this danger had diminished, or rather disappeared entirely, his own courage revived, while that of his steed began to droop. To this mutual but very material change was owing the fact, that the rider and the ass were now to be sought among that portion of the band who formed a sort of rear guard. Hither, then, the trapper contrived to turn his steed, without exciting the suspicions of any of his subtle companions. "Friend," commenced the old man, when he found himself in a situation favourable to discourse, "should you like to pass a dozen years among the savages with a shaved head, and a painted countenance, with, perhaps, a couple of wives and 5 or 6 children of a half-breed, to call you father?"
"Impossible!" exclaimed the startled naturalist. "I am indisposed to matrimony in general, and more especially to all admixture of the varieties of species, which only tend to tarnish the beauty and to interrupt the harmony of nature. Moreover, it is a painful innovation on the order of all nomenclatures."
"Ay, ay, you have reason enough for your distaste to such a life. But should these Sioux get you fairly into their village, such would be your luck, as certain as the sun rises and sets at the pleasure of the Lord."
"Marry me to a woman who is not adorned with the comeliness of the species!" responded the Doctor. "Of what crime have I been guilty, that so grievous a punishment should await the offence? To marry a man against the movements of his will is to do a violence to human nature."
"Now, that you speak of nature, I have hopes that the gift of reason has not altogether deserted your brain," returned the old man, with a covert expression playing about the angles of his deep-set eyes, which betrayed he was not entirely destitute of humour. "Nay, they may conceive you a remarkable subject for their kindness, and for that matter marry you to 5 or 6. I have known in my days favoured chiefs who had numberless wives."
"But why should they meditate this vengeance?" demanded the Doctor, whose hair began to rise, as if each fibre was possessed of sensibility. "What evil have I done?"
"It is the fashion of their kindness. When they come to learn that you are a great medicine, they will adopt you in the tribe, and some mighty chief will give you his name and perhaps his daughter, or it may be a wife or 2 of his own, who have dwelt long in his lodge, and of whose value he is a judge by experience."
"The governor and founder of natural harmony protect me!" ejaculated the Doctor. "I have no affinity to a single consort, much less to duplicates and triplicates of the class. I shall certainly essay a flight from their abodes before I mingle in so violent a conjunction."
"There is reason in your words, but why not attempt the race you speak of now?"
The naturalist looked fearfully around, as if he had an inclination to make an instant exhibition of his desperate intention, but the dusky figures, who were riding on every side of him, seemed suddenly tripled in number, and the darkness, that was already thickening on the prairie, appeared in his eyes to possess the glare of high noon. "It would be premature, and reason forbids it," he answered. Leave me, venerable venerator, to the counsel of my own thoughts, and when my plans are properly classed, I will advise you of my resolutions."
"Resolutions!" repeated the old man, shaking his head a little contemptuously, as he gave the rein to his horse, and allowed him to mingle with the steeds of the savages. "Resolution is a word that is talked of in the settlements, and felt on the borders. Does my brother know the beast on which the Pale-face rides?" he continued, addressing a gloomy-looking warrior in his own tongue, and making a motion with his arm that at the same time directed his attention to the naturalist and the meek Asinus. The Teton turned his eyes for a minute on the animal, but disdained to manifest the smallest portion of that wonder he had felt, in common with all his companions, on first viewing so rare a quadruped. The trapper was not ignorant that while asses and mules were beginning to be known to those tribes who dwelt nearest the Mexicos, they were not usually encountered so far north as the waters of La Platte. He therefore managed to read the mute astonishment that lay so deeply concealed in the tawny visage of the savage, and took his measures accordingly. "Does my brother think that the rider is a warrior of the Pale-faces?" he demanded, when he believed that sufficient time had elapsed for a full examination of the pacific mien of the naturalist. The flash of scorn which shot across the features of the Teton was visible, even by the dim light of the stars. "Is a Dahcotah a fool?" was the answer. "They are a wise nation, whose eyes are never shut. Much do I wonder that they have not seen the great medicine of the Big knives." "Wah!" exclaimed his companion, suffering the whole of his amazement to burst out of his dark, rigid countenance at the surprise, like a flash of lightning illuminating the gloom of midnight. "The Dahcotah knows that my tongue is not forked. Let him open his eyes wider. Does he not see a very great medicine?" The light was not necessary to recall to the savage each feature in the really remarkable costume and equipage of Dr. Battius. In common with the rest of the band, and in conformity with the universal practice of the Indians, this warrior, while he had suffered no gaze of idle curiosity to disgrace his manhood, had not permitted a single distinctive mark, which might characterize any one of the strangers, to escape his vigilance. He knew the air, the stature, the dress, and the features, even to the colour of the eyes and of the hair, of every one of the Big knives whom he had thus strangely encountered, and deeply had he ruminated on the causes which could have led a party so singularly constituted into the haunts of the rude inhabitants of his native wastes. He had already considered the several physical powers of the whole party, and had duly compared their abilities with that he supposed might have been their intentions. Warriors they were not, for the Big knives, like the Sioux, left their women in their villages when they went out on the bloody path. The same objections applied to them as hunters, and even as traders, the two characters under which the white men commonly appeared in their villages. He had heard of a great council, at which the Manahasha, or Long knives, and the Washio-Mantika, or Spaniards, had smoked together, when the latter had sold to the former their incomprehensible rights over these vast regions, through which his nation had roamed in freedom for so many ages. His simple mind had not been able to embrace the reasons why one people should thus assume a superiority over the possessions of another, and it will readily be perceived, that at the hint just received from the trapper, he was not indisposed to fancy that some of the hidden subtility of that magical influence, of which he was so firm a believer, was about to be practised by the unsuspecting subject of their conversation, in furtherance of these mysterious claims. Abandoning, therefore, all the reserve and dignity of his manner, under the conscious helplessness of ignorance, he turned to the old man, and stretching forth his arms, as if to denote how much he lay at his mercy, he said— "Let my father look at me. I am a wild man of the prairies. My body is naked, my hands empty, my skin red. I have struck the Pawnees, the Kansas, the Omahas, the Osages, and even the Long knives. I am a man amid warriors, but a woman among the conjurors. Let my father speak. The ears of a Teton are open. He listens like a deer to the step of the cougar." "Such are the wise and unsearchable ways of one who alone knows good from evil," exclaimed the trapper, in English. "To some He grants cunning, and on others He bestows the gift of manhood. It is humbling, and it is afflicting to see so noble a creature as this, who has fought in many a bloody fray, truckling before his superstition like a beggar asking for the bones you would throw to the dogs." The Lord will forgive me for playing with the ignorance of the savage, for He knows I do it in no mockery of His state, or an idle vaunting of my own, but in order to save mortal life, and to give justice to the wrong, while I defeat the deviltries of the wicked. Teton," speaking again in the language of the listener, "I ask you, is not that a wonderful medicine? If the Dahcotahs are wise, they will not breathe the air he breathes, nor touch his robes. They know that the Wakanshika (bad spirit) loves his own children, and will not turn his back on him that does them harm." The old man delivered this opinion in an ominous and sententious manner, and then rode apart as if he had said enough. The result justified his expectations. The warrior to whom he had addressed himself was now slow to communicate his important knowledge to the rest of the rear guard, and, in a very few moments, the naturalist was the object of general observation and reverence. The trapper, who understood that the natives often worshipped, with a view to propitiate the evil spirit, awaited the workings of his artifice with the coolness of one who had not the smallest interest in its effects. It was not long before he saw one dark figure after another lashing his horse and galloping ahead into the centre of the band, until Weucha alone remained nigh the persons of himself and Obed. The very dullness of this grovelling-minded savage, who continued gazing at the supposed conjuror with a sort of stupid admiration, opposed now the only obstacle to the complete success of his artifice. Thoroughly understanding the character of this Indian, the old man lost no time in getting rid of him also. Riding to his side, he said, in an affected whisper, "Has Weucha drunk of the milk of the Big knives to-day?" "Hugh!" exclaimed the savage, every dull thought instantly recalled from heaven to earth by the question. "Because the great captain of my people, who rides in front, has a cow that is never empty, I know it will not be long before he will say, 'Are any of my red brethren dry?'" The words were scarcely uttered before Weucha in his turn quickened the gait of his beast, and was soon blended with the rest of the dark group, who were riding at a more moderate pace a few rods in advance. The trapper, who knew how fickle and sudden were the changes of a savage mind, did not lose a moment in profiting by this advantage. He loosened the reins of his own impatient steed, and in an instant he was again at the side of Obed. "Do you see the twinkling star, that is, maybe, the length of 4 rifles above the prairie? Hereaway to the north, I mean." "Ay, it is of the constellation." "A tut for your constellations, man! Do you see the star I mean? Tell me, in the English of the land, yes or no?" "Yes." "The moment my back is turned, pull upon the rein of your ass, until you lose sight of the savages. Then take the Lord for your dependence, and yonder star for your guide. Turn neither to the right hand, nor to the left, but make diligent use of your time, for your beast is not quick of foot, and every inch of prairie you gain is a day added to your liberty, or to your life." Without waiting to listen to the queries which the naturalist was about to put, the old man again loosened the reins of his horse, and presently he too was blended with the group in front. Obed was now alone. Asinus willingly obeyed the hint, which his master soon gave, rather in desperation than with any very collected understanding of the orders he had received, and checked his pace accordingly. As the Tetons, however, rode at a hand gallop, but a moment of time was necessary, after the ass began to walk, to remove them effectually from before the vision of his rider. Without plan, expectation, or hope of any sort, except that of escaping from his dangerous neighbours, the Doctor, first feeling, to assure himself that the package, which contained the miserable remnants of his specimens and notes, was safe at his crupper, turned the head of the beast in the required direction, and kicking him with a species of fury, he soon succeeded in exciting the speed of the patient animal into a smart run. He had barely time to descend into a hollow, and ascend the adjoining swell of the prairie, before he heard, or fancied he heard, his name shouted, in good English, from the throats of 20 Tetons. The delusion gave a new impulse to his ardour, and no professor of the Sultan art ever applied himself with greater industry than the naturalist now used his heels on the ribs of Asinus. The conflict endured for several minutes without interruption, and to all appearances it might have continued to the present moment, had not the meek temper of the beast become unduly excited. Borrowing an idea from the manner in which his master exhibited his agitation, Asinus so far changed the application of his own heels as to raise them simultaneously with a certain indignant flourish into the air, a measure that instantly decided the controversy in his favour. Obed took leave of his seat, as of a position no longer tenable, continuing, however, the direction of his flight, while the ass, like a conqueror, took possession of the field of battle, beginning to crop the dry herbage, as the fruits of victory. When Dr. Battius had recovered his feet, and rallied his faculties, which were in a good deal of disorder from the hurried manner in which he had abandoned his former situation, he returned in quest of his specimens and of his ass. Asinus displayed enough of magnanimity to render the interview amicable, and thenceforth the naturalist continued the required route with very commendable industry, but with a much more tempered discretion. In the meantime, the old trapper had not lost sight of the important movements that he had undertaken to control. Obed had not been mistaken in supposing that he was already missed and sought, though his imagination had corrupted certain savage cries into the well-known sounds that composed his own Latinized name. The truth was simply this: the warriors of the rear guard had not failed to apprise those in front of the mysterious character with which it had pleased the trapper to invest the unsuspecting naturalist. The same untutored admiration, which on the receipt of this intelligence had driven those in the rear to the front, now drove many of the front to the rear. The doctor was of course absent, and the outcry was no more than the wild yells, which were raised in the first burst of savage disappointment. But the authority of Mahtoree was prompt to aid the ingenuity of the trapper in suppressing these dangerous sounds. When order was restored, and the former was made acquainted with the reason why his young men had betrayed so strong a mark of indiscretion, the old man, who had taken a post at his elbow, saw, with alarm, the gleam of keen distrust that flashed in his swarthy visage. "Where is your conjuror?" demanded the chief, turning suddenly to the trapper, as if he meant to make him responsible for the reappearance of Obed. "Can't I tell my brother the number of the stars? The ways of a great medicine are not like the ways of other men." "Listen to me, grey head, and count my words," continued the other, bending on his rude saddle bow, like some chevalier of a more civilized race, and speaking in the haughty tones of absolute power. "The Dahcotahs have not chosen a woman for their chief. When Mahtoree feels the power of a great medicine, he will tremble. Until then he will look with his own eyes, without borrowing sight from a pale-face. If your conjuror is not with his friends in the morning, my young men shall look for him. Your ears are open. Enough!" The trapper was not sorry to find that so long a respite was granted. He had before found reason to believe that the Teton partisan was one of those bold spirits who overstep the limits which use and education fix to the opinions of man in every state of society, and he now saw plainly that he must adopt some artifice to deceive him, different from that which had succeeded so well with his followers. The sudden appearance of the rock, however, which hove up, a bleak and ragged mass, out of the darkness ahead, put an end, for the present, to the discourse. Mahtoree giving all his thoughts to the execution of his designs on the rest of the squatter's movables, a murmur ran through the band, as each dark warrior caught a glimpse of the desired haven, after which the nicest ear might have listened in vain to catch a sound louder than the rustling of feet among the tall grass of the prairie. But the vigilance of Esther was not easily deceived. She had long listened anxiously to the suspicious sounds which approached the rock across the naked waste, nor had the sudden outcry been unheard by the unwearied sentinels of the rock. The savages, who had dismounted at some little distance, had not time to draw around the base of the hill in their customary silent and insidious manner, before the voice of the Amazon was raised, demanding— "Who is beneath? Answer for your lives! Sioux or devils, I fear ye not." No answer was given to this challenge, every warrior halting where he stood, confident that his dusky form was blended with the shadows of the plain. It was at this moment that the trapper determined to escape. He had been left with the rest of his friends under the surveillance of those who were assigned to the duty of watching the horses, and as they all continued mounted, the moment appeared favourable to his project. The attention of the guards was drawn to the rock, and a heavy cloud driving above them at that instant obscured even the feeble light which fell from the stars. Leaning on the neck of his horse, the old man muttered— "Where is my pup? Where is it? Hector, where is it? Dog?" The hound caught the well-known sounds, and answered by a whine of friendship, which threatened to break out into one of his piercing howls. The trapper was in the act of raising himself from this successful exploit, when he felt the hand of Weucha grasping his throat, as if determined to suppress his voice by the very unequivocal process of strangulation. Profiting by the circumstance, he raised another low sound, as in the natural effort of breathing, which drew a second responsive cry from the faithful hound. Weucha instantly abandoned his hold of the master in order to wreak his vengeance on the dog. But the voice of Esther was again heard, and every other design was abandoned in order to listen.
"Ay, whine and deform your throats as you may, ye imps of darkness," she said, with a cracked but scornful laugh. "I know ye. Tarry, and ye shall have light for your misdeeds. Put in the coal, Phoebe, put in the coal. Your father and the boys shall see that they are wanted at home to welcome their guest."
As she spoke, a strong light, like that of a brilliant star, was seen on the very pinnacle of the rock. Then followed a forked flame, which curled for a moment amid the windings of an enormous pile of brush, and flashing upward in a united sheet, it wavered to and fro in the passing air, shedding a bright glare on every object within its influence. A taunting laugh was heard from the height, in which the voices of all ages mingled, as though they triumphed at having so successfully exposed the treacherous intentions of the Tetons. The trapper looked about him to ascertain in what situations he might find his friends. True to the signals, Middleton and Paul had drawn a little apart, and now stood ready, by every appearance, to commence their flight at the third repetition of the cry. Hector had escaped his savage pursuer, and was again crouching at the heels of his master's horse. But the broad circle of light was gradually increasing in extent and power, and the old man, whose eye and judgment so rarely failed him, patiently awaited a more propitious moment for his enterprise. "Now, Ishmael, my man, if sight and hand are true as ever, now is the time to work upon these redskins, who claim to own all your property, even to wife and children. Now, my good man, prove both breed and character." A distant shout was heard in the direction of the approaching party of the squatter, assuring the female garrison that succour was not far distant. Esther answered to the grateful sounds by a cracked cry of her own, lifting her form in the first burst of exultation above the rock in a manner to be visible to all below. Not content with this dangerous exposure of her person, she was in the act of tossing her arms in triumph, when the dark figure of Mahtoree shot into the light and pinioned them to her side. The forms of the three warriors glided across the top of the rock, looking like naked demons flitting among the clouds. The air was filled with the brands of the beacon, and a heavy darkness succeeded, not unlike that of the appalling instant when the last rays of the sun are excluded by the intervening mass of the moon. A yell of triumph burst from the savages in their turn, and was rather accompanied than followed by a long, loud whine from Hector. In an instant the old man was between the horses of Middleton and Paul, extending a hand to the bridle of each, in order to check the impatience of their riders. "Softly, softly," he whispered. "Their eyes are as marvellously shut for the minute, as if the Lord had stricken them blind, but their ears are open. Softly, softly. For 50 rods at least, we must move no faster than a walk." The 5 minutes of doubt that succeeded appeared like an age to all but the trapper. As their sight was gradually restored, it seemed to each that the momentary gloom, which followed the extinction of the beacon, was to be replaced by as broad a light as that of noonday. Gradually the old man, however, suffered the animals to quicken their steps, until they had gained the centre of one of the prairie bottoms. Then, laughing in his quiet manner, he released the reins, and said— "Now, let them give play to their legs, but keep on the old fog to deaden the sounds." It is needless to say how cheerfully he was obeyed. In a few more minutes they ascended and crossed the swell of the land, after which the flight was continued at the top of their horses' speed, keeping the indicated star in view, as the labouring bark steers for the light which points the way to a haven and security. End of chapter 21. Of the Prairie by James Fenimore Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Peck.
The clouds and sunbeams o'er his eye, that once their shades and glories threw, have left, in yonder silent sky, no vestige where they flew. Montgomery.
A stillness, as deep as that which marked the gloomy waste in their front, was observed by the fugitives to distinguish the spot they had just abandoned. Even the trapper lent his practised faculties, in vain, to detect any of the well-known signs, which might establish the important fact that hostilities had actually commenced between the parties of Mahtoree and Ishmael. But their horses carried them out of the reach of sounds, without the occurrence of the smallest evidence of the sort. The old man from time to time muttered his discontent, but manifested the uneasiness he actually entertained in no other manner, unless it might be in exhibiting a growing anxiety to urge the animals to increase their speed. He pointed out in passing the deserted swale where the family of the squatter had encamped the night they were introduced to the reader, and afterwards he maintained an ominous silence, ominous because his companions had already seen enough of his character to be convinced that the circumstances must be critical indeed, which possessed the power to disturb the well-regulated tranquillity of the old man's mind. "Have we not done enough?" Middleton demanded, in tenderness to the inability of Inez and Ellen to endure so much fatigue, at the end of some hours. "We have ridden hard, and have crossed a wide tract of plain. It is time to seek a place of rest." "You must seek it, then, in heaven, if you find yourselves unequal to a longer march," murmured the old trapper. "Had the Tetons and the squatter come to blows, as any one might see in the nature of things they were bound to do, there would be time to look about us, and to calculate not only the chances, but the comforts of the journey. But as the case actually is, I should consider it certain death, or endless captivity, to trust our eyes with sleep, until our heads are fairly hid in some uncommon cover." "I know not," returned the youth, who reflected more on the sufferings of the fragile being he supported, than on the experience of his companion. "I know not. We have ridden leagues, and I can see no extraordinary signs of danger. If you fear for yourself, my good friend, believe me you are wrong, for—" "Your grandfather, were he living and here," interrupted the old man, stretching forth a hand, and laying a finger impressively on the arm of Middleton, "would have spared those words. He had some reason to think, that in the prime of my days, when my eye was quicker than the hawk's, and my limbs were as active as the legs of the fallow deer, I never clung too eagerly and too fondly to life. Then why should I now feel such a childish affection for a thing that I know to be vain, and the companion of pain and sorrow? Let the Tetons do their worst. They will not find a miserable and worn-out trapper the loudest in his complaints or his prayers." "Pardon me, my worthy, my inestimable friend," exclaimed the repentant young man, warmly grasping the hand which the other was in the act of withdrawing. "I knew not what I said, or rather I thought only of those whose tenderness we are most bound to consider." "Enough. It is natural, and it is right. Therein your grandfather would have done the very same. Ah's me, what a number of seasons, hot and cold, wet and dry, have rolled over my poor head, since the time we worried it out together, among the red Hurons of the lakes, back in those rugged mountains of old York, and many a noble buck has since the day fallen by my hand. Ay, and many a thieving Mingo, too. Tell me, lad, did the general, for general I know he got to be, did he ever tell you of the deer we took? That night the outlayers of the accursed tribe drove us to the caves on the island, and how we feasted in drunken security?" "I have often heard him mention the smallest circumstance of the night you mean, but—" "And the singer, and his open throat, and his shoutings in the fights," continued the old man, laughing joyously at the strength of his own recollections. All, he forgot nothing, even to the most trifling incident. Do you not—" "What! Did he tell you of the imp behind a log, and of the miserable devil who went over the fall, or of the wretch in the tree?" "Of each and all, with everything that concerned him, I should think." Footnote: They who have read the preceding books, in which the trapper appears as a hunter and a scout, will readily understand the allusions. "Ay," continued the old man, in a voice which betrayed how powerfully his own faculties retained the impression of the spectacle, "I have been a dweller in forests and in the wilderness for 70 years, and if any can pretend to know the world, or to have seen scary sights, it is myself. But never, before nor since, have I seen human man in such a state of mortal despair as that very savage, and yet he scorned to speak, or to cry out, or to own his forlorn condition. It is their gift, and nobly did he maintain it." "Harkee, old trapper," interrupted Paul, who, content with the knowledge that his waist was grasped by one of the arms of Ellen, had hitherto ridden in unusual silence. "My eyes are as true and as delicate as a humming-bird's in the day, but they are nothing worth boasting of by starlight. Is that a sick buffaloe crawling along in the bottom there, or is it one of the stray cattle of the savages?" The whole party drew up, in order to examine the object which Paul had pointed out. During most of the time they had ridden in the little vales, in order to seek the protection of the shadows, but just at that moment they had ascended a roll of the prairie in order to cross into the very bottom where this unknown animal was now seen. "Let us descend," said Middleton. "Be it beast or man, we are too strong to have any cause of fear." "Now, if the thing was not morally impossible," cried the trapper, who the reader must have already discovered was not always exact in the use of qualifying words, "if the thing was not morally impossible, I should say that was the man who journeys in search of reptiles and insects, our fellow traveller, the Doctor." "Why impossible? Did you not direct him to pursue this course in order to rejoin us?" "Ay, but did I not tell him to make an ass outdo the speed of a horse? You are right, said the trapper, interrupting himself, as by gradually lessening the distance between them, his eyes assured him it was Obed and Asinus whom he saw. "You are right, as certainly as the thing is a miracle, Lord. What a thing is fear! How now, friend? You have been industrious to have got so far ahead in so short a time. I marvel at the speed of the ass."
"Asinus is overcome," returned the naturalist, mournfully. "The animal has certainly not been idle since we separated, but he declines all my admonitions and invitations to proceed. I hope there is no instant fear from the savages."
"I cannot say that. Matters are not as they should be, atween the squatter and the Tetons, nor will I answer as yet for the safety of any scalp among us. The beast is broken down. You have urged him beyond his natural gifts, and he is like a worried hound. There is pity and discretion in all things, even though a man be riding for his life."
"You indicated the star," returned the Doctor, "and I deemed it expedient to use great diligence in pursuing the direction."
"Did you expect to reach it by such haste? Go, you talk boldly of the creatures of the Lord, though I plainly see you are but a child in matters that concern their gifts and instincts. What a plight would you now be in, if there was a need for a long and quick push with our heels?"
"The fault exists in the formation of the quadruped," said Obed, whose placid temper began to revolt under so many scandalous imputations. "Had there been rotary levers for 2 of the members, a moiety of the fatigue would have been saved, for one item."
"That of your moieties and rotaries and items, man! A jaded ass is a jaded ass, and he who denies it is but a brother of the beast itself. Now, captain, we are driven to choose one of 2 evils. We must either abandon this man, who has been too much with us through good and bad to be easily cast away, or we must seek a cover to let the animal rest."
"Venerable venerator," exclaimed the alarmed Obed, "I conjure you, by all the secret sympathies of our common nature, by all the hidden—"
Fear has brought him to talk a little rational sense. It is not nature, truly, to abandon a brother in distress, and Lord, he knows that I have never yet done the shameful deed. You are right, friend, you are right. We must all be hidden, and that speedily. But what to do with the ass? Friend Doctor, do you truly value the life of the creature?"
"He is an ancient and faithful servant," returned the disconsolate Obed, "and with pain should I see him come to any harm. Fetter his lower limbs, and leave him to repose in this bed of herbage. I will engage he shall be found where he is left in the morning."
"And the Sioux?
What would become of the beast, should any of the red imps catch a peep at his ears, growing up out of the grass, like to mullein tops?" cried the bee hunter. "They would stick him as full of arrows as a woman's cushion and full of pins, and then believe they had done the job for the father of all rabbits. My word for it, out they would find out their blunder at the first mouthful."
Middleton, who began to grow impatient under the protracted discussion, interposed, and as a good deal of deference was paid to his rank, he quickly prevailed in his efforts to effect a sort of compromise. The humble Asinus, too meek and too weary to make any resistance, was soon tethered and deposited in his bed of dying grass, where he was left with a perfect confidence on the part of his master of finding him again at the expiration of a few hours. The old man strongly remonstrated against this arrangement, and more than once hinted that the knife was much more certain than the tether, But the petitions of Obed, aided perhaps by the secret reluctance of the trapper to destroy the beast, were the means of saving its life. When Asinus was thus secured, and, as his master believed, secreted, the whole party proceeded to find some place where they might rest themselves, during the time required for the repose of the animal. According to the calculations of the trapper, they had ridden 20 miles since the commencement of their flight. The delicate frame of Inez began to droop under the excessive fatigue, nor was the more robust but still feminine person of Ellen insensible to the extraordinary effort she had made. Middleton himself was not sorry to repose, nor did the vigorous and high-spirited Paul hesitate to confess that he should be all the better for a little rest. The old man alone seemed indifferent to the usual claims of nature. Although but little accustomed to the unusual description of exercise he had just been taking, he appeared to bid defiance to all the usual attacks of human infirmities. Though evidently so near its dissolution, his attenuated frame still stood like the shaft of a seasoned oak, dry, naked, and a tempest-driven, but unbending and apparently indurated to the consistency of stone. On the present occasion he conducted the search for a resting place, which was immediately commenced, with all the energy of youth, tempered by the discretion and experience of his great age. The bed of grass in which the Doctor had been met, and in which his ass had just been left, was followed a little distance until it was found that the rolling swells of the prairie were melting away into one vast level plain, that was covered, for miles on miles, with the same species of herbage. "Ah, this may do, this may do," said the old man, when they arrived on the borders of this sea of withered grass. "I know the spot, and often have I lain in its secret holes for days at a time, while the savages have been hunting the buffaloes on the open ground. We must enter it with great care, for a broad trail might be seen, and Indian curiosity is a dangerous neighbour." Leading the way himself, he selected a spot where the tall, coarse herbage stood most erect, growing not unlike a bed of reeds, both in height and density. Here he entered singly, directing the others to follow as nearly as possible in his own footsteps. When they had paused for some 100 or 2 feet into the wilderness of the weeds, he gave his directions to Paul and Middleton, who continued a direct route deeper into the place, while he dismounted and returned on his tracks to the margin of the meadow. Here he passed many minutes in replacing the trodden grass, and in effacing, as far as possible, every evidence of their passage. In the meantime, the rest of the party continued their progress, not without toil, and consequently at a very moderate gait, until they had penetrated a mile into the place. Here they found a spot suited to their circumstances, and dismounting, they began to make their dispositions to pass the remainder of the night. By this time the trapper had rejoined the party, and again resumed the direction of their proceedings. The weeds and grass were soon plucked and cut from an area of sufficient extent, and a bed for Inez and Ellen was speedily made, a little apart, which for sweetness and ease might have rivalled one of down. The exhausted females, after receiving some light refreshments from the provident stores of Paul and the old man, now sought their repose, leaving their more stout companions at liberty to provide for their own necessities. Middleton and Paul were not long in following the example of their betrothed, leaving the trapper and the naturalist still seated around a savoury dish of bison's meat, which had been cooked at a precious halt, and which was, as usual, eaten cold. A certain lingering sensation, which had so long been uppermost in the mind of Obed, temporarily banished sleep, and as for the old man, his wants were rendered, by habit and necessity, as seemingly subject to his will as if they altogether depended on the pleasure of the moment. Like his companion, he chose therefore to watch instead of sleeping.
"If the children of ease and security knew the hardships and dangers the students of nature encounter in their behalf," said Obed, after a moment of silence, when Middleton took his leave for the night, "pillars of silver and statues of brass would be reared as the everlasting monuments of their glory."
I know not, returned his companion. "Silver is far from plenty, at least in the wilderness, and your brazen idols are forbidden in the commandments of the Lord."
"Such, indeed, was the opinion of the great lawgiver of the Jews, but the Egyptians, and the Chaldeans, the Greeks, and the Romans were wont to manifest their gratitude in these types of the human form. Indeed, many of the illustrious masters of antiquity have by the aid of science and skill even outdone the works of nature and exhibited a beauty and perfection in the human form that are difficult to be found in the rarest living specimens of any of the species, genus homo.
"Can your idols walk or speak, or have they the glorious gift of reason?" demanded the trapper, with some indignation in his voice. "Though but little given to run into the noise and chatter of the settlements, yet have I been in the towns in my day, to barter the peltry for lead and powder, and often have I seen your waxen dolls, with their tawdry clothes and glass eyes."
"Waxen dolls!" interrupted Obed. "It is profanation in the view of the arts, to liken the miserable handiwork of the dealers in wax to the pure models of antiquity."
"It is profanation in the eyes of the Lord," retorted the old man, "to liken the words of his creatures to the power of his own hand."
"Venerable venerator," resumed the naturalist, clearing his throat, like one who was much in earnest, "let us discuss understandingly and in amity. You speak of the dross of ignorance, whereas my memory dwells on those precious jewels, which it was my happy fortune, formerly, to witness among the treasured glories of the Old World."
"Old World," returned the trapper, "that is the miserable cry of all the half-starved miscreants that have come into this blessed land, since the days of my boyhood. They tell you of the Old World, as if the Lord had not the power and the will to create the universe in a day, or as if he had not bestowed his gifts with an equal hand, though not with an equal mind or equal wisdom have they been received and used. Were they to say a worn-out and an abused and a sacrilegious world, they might not be so far from the truth." Dr. Battius, who found it quite as arduous a task to maintain any of his favourite positions with so irregular an antagonist, as he would have found it difficult to keep his feet within the hug of a western wrestler, hemmed aloud, and profited by the new opening the trapper had made, to shift the grounds of the discussion.
"By old and new world, my excellent associate," he said, "it is not to be understood that the hills and the valleys, the rocks and the rivers of our own moiety of the earth do not, physically speaking, bear a date as ancient as the spot on which the bricks of Babylon are found. It merely signifies that its moral existence is not co-equal with its physical or geological formation."
"Anan,"
said the old man, looking up inquiringly into the face of the philosopher. "Merely that it has not been so long known in morals as the other countries of Christendom."
"So much the better, so much the better. I am no great admirer of your old morals, as you call them, for I have ever found, and I have lived long, as it were, in the very heart of nature, that your old morals are none of the best. Mankind twist and turn the rules of the Lord to suit their own wickedness, when their devilish cunning has had too much time to trifle with his commands."
"Nay, venerable hunter, still am I not comprehended. By morals I do not mean the limited and literal signification of the term, such as is conveyed in its synonym morality, but the practices of men as connected with their daily intercourse, their institutions, and their laws."
"And such I call barefaced and downright wantonness and waste," interrupted his sturdy disputant.
"Well, be it so," returned the doctor, abandoning the explanation in despair. "Perhaps I have conceded too much," he then instantly added, fancying that he still saw the glimmerings of an argument through another chink in the discourse. "Perhaps I have conceded too much, in saying that this hemisphere is literally as old in its formation as that which embraces the venerable quarters of Europe, Asia, and Africa."
"It is easy to say a pine is not so tall as an alder, but it would be hard to prove. Can you give a reason for such a belief?"
"The reasons are numerous and powerful," returned the doctor, delighted by this encouraging opening. "Look into the plains of Egypt and Arabia. Their sandy deserts teem with the monuments of their antiquity, and then we have also recorded documents of their glory, doubling the proofs of their former greatness, now that they lie stripped of their fertility. While we look in vain for similar evidences that man has ever reached the summit of civilization on this continent, or search, without our reward, for the path by which he has made the downward journey to his present condition of second childhood."
"And what see you in all this?"
demanded the trapper, who, though a little confused by the terms of his companion, seized the thread of his ideas. "A demonstration of my problem, that nature did not make so vast a region to lie an uninhabited waste so many ages. This is merely the moral view of the subject. As to the more exact and geological—"
"Your morals are exact enough for me," returned the old man, "for I think I see in them the very pride of folly. I am but little gifted in the fables of what you call the old world, seeing that my time has been mainly passed looking nature steadily in the face, and in reasoning on what I've seen, rather than what I've heard in traditions. But I have never shut my ears to the words of the good book, and many is the long winter evening that I have passed in the wigwams of the Delawares, listening to the good Moravians as they dealt forth the history and doctrines of the elder times to the people of the Lenape. It was pleasant to hearken to such wisdom after a weary hunt. Right pleasant did I find it, and often have I talked the matter over with the Great Serpent of the Delawares, in the more peaceful hours of our outlyings, whether it might be on the trail of a war party of the Mingos, or on the watch for a York deer. I remember to have heard it then and there said, that the blessed land was once fertile as the bottoms of the Mississippi, and groaning with its stores of grain and fruits, but that the judgment has since fallen upon it, and that it is now more remarkable for its barrenness than any qualities to boast of.
It is true, but Egypt, nay, much of Africa furnishes still more striking proofs of this exhaustion of nature.
Tell me, interrupted the old man, is it a certain truth that buildings are still standing in the land of Pharaoh, which may be likened in their stature to the hills of the earth?
It is as true as that nature never refuses to bestow her incisors on the animals, mammalia. Genus Homo.
It is very marvellous, and it proves how great He must be, when His miserable creatures can accomplish such wonders. Many men must have been needed to finish such an edifice, ay, and men gifted with strength and skill too. Does the land abound with such a race to this hour?
Far from it. Most of the country is a desert, and but for a mighty river, all would be so.
Yes, rivers are rare gifts to such as till the ground, as any one may see who journeys far from the Rocky Mountains and the Mississippi. But how do you account for these changes on the face of the 'arth itself, and for this downfall of nations, you men of the schools?
It is to be ascribed to moral
You're right. It is their morals, their wickedness, and their pride, and chiefly their waste, that has done it all. Now listen to what the experience of an old man teaches them. I have lived long, as these grey hairs and wrinkled hands will show, even though my tongue should fail in the wisdom of my years. And I have seen much of the folly of man, for his nature is the same, be he born in the wilderness, or be he born in the towns. To my weak judgment, it hath ever seemed that his gifts are not equal to his wishes, that he would mount into the heavens with all his deformities about him, if he only knew the road, no one will gainsay, that witnesses his bitter strivings upon 'arth. If his power is not equal to his will, it is because the wisdom of the Lord hath set bounds to his evil workings.
It is much too certain that certain facts will warrant a theory, which teaches the natural depravity of the genus. But if science could be fairly brought to bear on a whole species at once, for instance, education might eradicate the evil principle.
That for your education! The time has been when I have thought it possible to make a companion of a beast. Many are the cubs, and many are the speckled fawns that I have reared with these old hands, until I have even fancied them rational and altered beings. But what did it amount to? The bear would bite, and the deer would run, notwithstanding my wicked conceit in fancying I could change a temper that the Lord himself had seen fit to bestow. Now, if man is so blinded in his folly as to go on ages, doing harm chiefly to himself, there is the same reason to think that he has wrought his evil here as in the countries you call so old. Look about you, man. Where are the multitudes that once peopled these prairies? The kings and the palaces, the riches and the mightiness of this desert?
Where are the monuments that would prove the truth of so vague a theory?
I know not what you call a monument.
The works of man, the glories of Thebes and Baalbec, columns, catacombs, and pyramids, standing amid the sands of the east, like wrecks on a rocky shore, to testify to the storms of ages.
They are gone. Time has lasted too long for them. For why? Time was made by the Lord, and they were made by man. This very spot of reeds and grass on which you now sit may once have been the garden of some mighty king. It is the fate of all things to ripen, and then to decay. The tree blossoms and bears its fruit, which falls, rots, withers, and even the seed is lost. Go, count the rings of the oak and of the sycamore. They lie in circles, one about another, until the eye is blinded in striving to make out their numbers. And yet a full change of the seasons comes round while the stem is winding one of these little lines about itself, like the buffalo changing his coat, or the buck his horns. And what does it all amount to? there does the noble tree fill its place in the forest, loftier, and grander, and richer, and more difficult to imitate, than any of your pitiful pillars, for 1,000 years, until the time which the Lord hath given it is full. Then come the winds that you cannot see, to rive its bark, and the waters from the heavens to soften its pores, and the rot, which all can feel and none can understand, to humble its pride and bring it to the ground. From that moment its beauty begins to perish. It lies another 100 years, a mouldering log, and then a mound of moss and earth, a sad effigy of a human grave. This is one of your genuine monuments, though made by a very different power than such as belongs to your chiseling masonry. And after all, the cunningest scout of the whole Dakota nation might pass his life in searching for the spot where it fell, and be no wiser when his eyes grew dim, than when they were first opened. As if that was not enough to convince man of his ignorance, and as though it were put there in mockery of his conceit, a pine shoots up from the roots of the oak, just as barrenness comes after fertility, or as these wastes have been spread, where a garden may have been created. Tell me not of your worlds that are old. It is blasphemous to set bounds and seasons in this manner to the works of the Almighty, like a woman counting the ages of her young.
"Friend hunter, or trapper," returned the naturalist, clearing his throat in some intellectual confusion at the vigorous attack of his companion, "your deductions, if admitted by the world, would sadly circumscribe the efforts of reason, and much abridge the boundaries of knowledge."
"So much the better, so much the better, for I have always found that a conceited man never knows content. All things prove it. Why have we not the wings of the pigeon, the eyes of the eagle, and the legs of the moose, if it had been intended that man should be equal to all his wishes?"
"There are certain physical defects, venerable trapper, in which I am always ready to admit great and happy alterations might be suggested. For example, in my own order of phalangacru—"
"Cruel enough would be the order, that should come from miserable hands like thine. A touch from such a finger would destroy the mocking deformity of a monkey. Go, go. Human folly is not needed to fill up the great design of God. There is no stature, no beauty, no proportions, nor any colours in which man himself can well be fashioned, that is not already done to his hands."
"That is touching another great and much disputed question," exclaimed the Doctor, who seized upon every distinct idea that the ardent and somewhat dogmatic old man left exposed to his mental grasp, with the vain hope of inducing a logical discussion, in which he might bring his battery of syllogisms to annihilate the unscientific defences of his antagonist. It is, however, unnecessary to our narrative to relate the erratic discourse that ensued. The old man eluded the annihilating blows of his adversary, as the light-armed soldier is wont to escape the efforts of the more regular warrior, even while he annoys him most, and an hour passed away without bringing any of the numerous subjects, on which they touched, to a satisfactory conclusion. The arguments acted, however, on the nervous system of the Doctor, like so many soothing sporifics, and by the time his aged companion was disposed to lay his head on his pack, Obed, refreshed by his recent mental joust, was in a condition to seek his natural rest, without enduring the torments of the incubus in the shapes of Teton warriors and bloody tomahawks.
End of chapter 22. Prairie by James Fenimore Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Peck.
"Save you, sir." Shakespeare.
The sleep of the fugitives lasted for several hours. The trapper was the first to shake off its influence, as he had been the last to court its refreshment. Rising, just as the grey light of the day began to brighten that portion of the studded vault which rested on the eastern margin of the plain, he summoned his companions from their warm lairs, and pointed out the necessity of their being once more on the alert. While Middleton attended to the arrangements necessary to the comforts of Inez and Ellen, in the long and painful journey which lay before them, the old man and Paul prepared the meal, which the former had advised them to take before they proceeded to horse. These several dispositions were not long in making, and the little group was soon seated about a repast which, though it might want the elegancies to which the bride of Middleton had been accustomed, was not deficient in the more important requisites of savour and nutriment. "When we get lower into the hunting grounds of the Pawnees," said the trapper, laying a morsel of delicate venison before Inez, on a little trencher neatly made of horn, and expressly for his own use. "We shall find the buffaloes fatter and sweeter, the deer in more abundance, and all the gifts of the Lord abounding to satisfy our wants. Perhaps we may even strike a beaver, and get a morsel from his tail, by way of a rare mouthful." Footnote: The American hunters consider the tail of the beaver the most nourishing of all food. "What course do you mean to pursue, when you have once thrown these bloodhounds from the chase?" demanded Middleton. "If I might advise," said Paul, "it would be to strike a watercourse, and get upon its downward current, as soon as may be. Give me a cottonwood, and I will turn you out a canoe that shall carry us, all, the jackass excepted, in perhaps the work of a day and night. Ellen here is a lively girl enough, but then she is no great race rider, and it would be far more comfortable to boat 600 or 800 miles, than to go loping along like so many elk measuring the prairies. Besides, water leaves no trail." "I will not swear to that," returned the trapper. "I have often thought the eyes of a red-skin would find a trail in air."
"See, Middleton," exclaimed Inez, in a sudden burst of youthful pleasure that caused her for a moment to forget her situation. "How lovely is that sky! Surely it contains a promise of happier times." "It is glorious," returned her husband. "Glorious and heavenly is that streak of vivid red, and here is still a brighter crimson. Rarely have I seen a richer rising of the sun."
"Rising of the sun," slowly repeated the old man, lifting his tall person from his seat with a deliberate and abstracted air, while he kept his eye riveted on the changing and certainly beautiful tints that were garnishing the vault of heaven. "Rising of the sun! I like not such risings of the sun. Ah's me! The imps have circumvented us with a vengeance. The prairie is on fire."
"God in heaven protect us!" cried Middleton, catching Inez to his bosom, under the instant impression of the imminence of their danger. "There is no time to lose, old man. Each instant is a day. Let us fly."
"Whither?" demanded the trapper, motioning him with calmness and dignity to arrest his steps. "In this wilderness of grass and reeds, you are like a vessel in the broad lakes without a compass. A single step on the wrong course might prove the destruction of us all. It is seldom danger is so pressing that there is not time enough for reason to do its work, young officer. Therefore let us await its biddings."
"For my own part," said Paul Hover, looking about him with no equivocal expression of concern, "I acknowledge that should this dry bed of weeds get fairly in a flame, a bee would have to make a flight higher than common to prevent his wings from scorching. Therefore, old trapper, I agree with the captain, and say, mount and run."
"Ye are wrong, ye are wrong. Man is not a beast to follow the gift of instinct, and to snuff up his knowledge by a taint in the air or a rumbling in the sound. But he must see and reason, and then conclude. So follow me a little to the left, where there is a rise in the ground, whence we may make our reconnoitrings."
The old man waved his hand with authority, and led the way without further parlance to the spot he had indicated, followed by the whole of his alarmed companions. An eye less practised than that of the trapper might have failed in discovering the gentle elevation to which he alluded, and which looked on the surface of the meadow like a growth a little taller than common. When they reached the place, however, the stinted grass itself announced the absence of that moisture, which had fed the rank weeds of most of the plain, and furnished a clue to the evidence by which he had judged of the formation of the ground hidden beneath. Here a few minutes were lost in breaking down the tops of the surrounding herbage, which, notwithstanding the advantage of their position, rose even above the heads of Middleton and Paul, and in obtaining a look-out that might command a view of the surrounding sea of fire. The frightful prospect added nothing to the hopes of those who had so fearful a stake in the result. Although the day was beginning to dawn, the vivid colours of the sky continued to deepen, as if the fierce element were bent on an impious rivalry of the light of the sun. Bright flashes of flame shot up here and there, along the margin of the waste, like the nimble coruscations of the north, but far more angry and threatening in their colour and changes. The anxiety of the rigid features of the trapper sensibly deepened, as he leisurely traced these evidences of a conflagration, which spread in a broad belt about their place of refuge, until he had encircled the whole horizon. Shaking his head, as he again turned his face to the point where the danger seemed nighest and most rapidly approaching, the old man said, "Now have we been cheating ourselves with the belief that we had thrown these Tetons from our trail,
while here is proof enough that they not only know where we lie, but that they intend to smoke us out like so many skulking beasts of prey. See, they have lighted the fire around the whole bottom at the same moment, and we are as completely hemmed in by the devils as an island by its waters."
"Let us mount and ride," cried Middleton. "Is life not worth a struggle?"
"Whither would ye go? Is a Teton horse a salamander, that he can walk amid fiery flames unhurt? Or do you think the Lord will show his might in your behalf, as in the days of old, and carry you harmless through such a furnace as you may see glowing beneath yonder red sky? There are Sioux, too, hemming the fire with their arrows and knives on every side of us, or I am no judge of their murderous deviltries."
"We will ride into the centre of the whole tribe," returned the youth fiercely, "and put their manhood to the test."
"Ay, it's well in words, but what would it prove in deeds? Here is a dealer in bees, who can teach you wisdom in a matter like this."
"Now, for that matter, old trapper," said Paul, stretching his authentic form like a mastiff conscious of his strength, "I am on the side of the captain, and am clearly for a race against the fire, though it line me into Teton wigwam. Here is Ellen who will—"
"Of what use? Of what use are your stout hearts, when the element of the Lord is to be conquered as well as human men? Look about you, friends. The wreath of smoke, that is rising from the bottoms, plainly says that there is no outlet from this spot, without crossing a belt of fire. Look for yourselves, my men, look for yourselves. If you can find a single opening, I will engage to follow."
The examination, which his companions so instantly and so attentively made, rather served to assure them of their desperate situation than to appease their fears. Huge columns of smoke were rolling up from the plain, and thickening in gloomy masses around the horizon. The red glow which gleamed upon their enormous folds, now lighting their volumes with the glare of the conflagration, and now flashing to another point, as the flame beneath glided ahead, leaving all behind enveloped in an awful darkness, and proclaiming louder than words the character of the imminent and approaching danger. "This is terrible!" exclaimed Middleton, folding the trembling Inez to his heart. "At such a time as this, and in such a manner!" "The gates of heaven are open to all who truly believe," murmured the pious devotee in his bosom. "This resignation is maddening! But we are men, and will make a struggle for our lives. How now, my brave and spirited friend, shall we yet mount and push across the flames, or shall we stand here, and see those we most love perish in this frightful manner without an effort?" "I am for a swarming time, and a flight before this hive is too hot to hold us," said the bee hunter, to whom it will be at once seen that Middleton addressed himself. "Come, old trapper, you must acknowledge that this is but a slow way of getting out of danger. If we tarry here much longer, it will be in the fashion that the bees lie around the straw after the hive has been smoked for its honey. You may hear the fire again to roar already, and I know by experience that when the flame once gets fairly into the prairie grass, it is no sloth that can outrun it."
"Think you," returned the old man, pointing scornfully at the mazes of the dry and matted grass which environed them, "that mortal feet can outstrip the speed of fire, on such a path? If I only knew now on which side these miscreants lay!"
"What say you, friend Doctor?" cried the bewildered Paul, turning to the naturalist with the sort of helplessness with which the strong are often apt to seek aid of the weak, when human power is baffled by the hand of a mightier being. "What say you? Have you no advice to give away, in a case of life and death?" The naturalist stood, tablets in hand, looking at the awful spectacle with as much composure as if the conflagration had been lighted in order to solve the difficulties of some scientific problem. Aroused by the question of his companion, he turned his equally calm, though differently occupied associate, the trapper, demanding, with the most provoking insensibility to the urgent nature of their situation: "Venerable hunter, you have often witnessed similar prismatic experiments?" He was rudely interrupted by Paul, who struck the tablets from his hands with a violence that betrayed the utter intellectual confusion which had overset the equanimity of his mind. Before time was allowed for remonstrance, the old man, who had continued during the whole scene like one much at a loss how to proceed, though also like one who was rather perplexed than alarmed, suddenly assumed a decided air, as if he no longer doubted on the course it was most advisable to pursue.
"It is time to be doing," he said, interrupting the controversy that was about to ensue between the naturalist and the bee hunter. "It is time to leave off books and moanings, and to be doing.
"You have come to your recollections too late, miserable old man," cried Middleton. "The flames are within a quarter of a mile of us, and the wind is bringing them down in this quarter with dreadful rapidity."
"Non, the flames! I care but little for the flames. If I only knew how to circumvent the cunning of the Tetons, as I know how to cheat the fire of its prey, there would be nothing needed but thanks to the Lord for our deliverance. Do you call this a fire? If you had seen what I have witnessed in the eastern hills, when mighty mountains were like the furnace of Smith, you would have known what it was to fear the flames, and to be thankful that you were spared. Come, lads, come. 'Tis time to be doing now, and to cease talking, for yonder curling flame is truly coming on like a trotting moose. Put hands upon this short and withered grass where we stand, and lay bare the 'arth."
"Would you think to deprive the fire of its victims in this childish manner?" exclaimed Middleton. A faint but solemn smile passed over the features of the old man, as he answered,
"Your grandfather would have said, that when the enemy was nigh, a soldier could do no better than to obey."
The captain felt the reproof, and instantly began to imitate the industry of Paul, who was tearing the decayed herbage from the ground in a sort of desperate compliance with the trapper's direction. Even Ellen lent her hands to the labour, nor was it long before Inez was seen similarly employed, though none amongst them knew why or wherefore. When life is thought to be the reward of labour, men are wont to be industrious. A very few moments sufficed to lay bare a spot of some 20 feet in diameter. Into one edge of this little area the trapper brought the females, directing Middleton and Paul to cover their light and inflammable dresses with the blankets of the party. So soon as this precaution was observed, the old man approached the opposite margin of the grass, which still environed him in a tall and dangerous circle, and selecting a handful of the driest of the herbage, he placed it over the pan of his rifle. The light combustible kindled at the flash. Then he placed the little flame in a bed of the standing fog, and withdrawing from the spot to the centre of the ring, he patiently awaited the result. The subtle element seized with avidity upon its new fuel, and in a moment forked flames were gliding among the grass, as the tongues of the ruminating animals are seen rolling among their food, apparently in quest of its sweetest portions.
"Now," said the old man, holding up a finger, and laughing in his peculiarly silent manner, "you shall see fire fight fire. Ah's me, many is the time I have burned a smooty path, from wantonness laziness to pick my way across a tangled bottom."
"But is this not fatal?" cried the amazed Middleton. "Are you not bringing the enemy nigher to us instead of avoiding it?"
"Do you scorch so easily? Your grandfather had a tougher skin, but we shall live to see. We shall all live to see." The experience of the trapper was in the right. As the fire gained strength and heat, it began to spread on all 3 sides, dying of itself on the 4th, for want of aliment. As it increased, and the sullen roaring announced its power, it cleared everything before it, leaving the black and smoking soil far more naked than if the scythe had swept the place. The situation of the fugitives would have still been hazardous had not the area enlarged as the flame encircled them. But, by advancing to the spot where the trapper had kindled the grass, they avoided the heat, and in a very few moments the flames began to recede in every quarter, leaving them enveloped in a cloud of smoke, but perfectly safe from the torrent of fire that was still furiously rolling onward. The spectators regarded the simple expedient of the trapper with that species of wonder, with which the courtiers of Ferdinand are said to have viewed the manner in which Columbus made his egg stand on its end, though with feelings that were filled with gratitude instead of envy. "Most wonderful!" said Middleton, when he saw the complete success of the means by which they had been rescued from a danger that he had conceived to be unavoidable. "The thought was a gift from heaven, and the hand that executed it should be immortal." "Old trapper," cried Paul, thrusting his fingers through his shaggy locks, "I have lined many a loaded bee into his hole, and know something of the nature of the woods, but this is robbing a hornet of his sting without touching the insect." "It will do, it will do," returned the old man, who after the first moment of his success seemed to think no more of the exploit. "Now get the horses in readiness. Let the flames do their work for a short half-hour, and then we will mount. That time is needed to cool the meadow, for these unshod Teton beasts are as tender on the hoof as a barefooted girl."
Middleton and Paul, who considered this unlooked-for escape as a species of resurrection, patiently awaited the time the trapper mentioned with renewed confidence in the infallibility of his judgment.
The doctor regained his tablets, a little the worse from having fallen among the grass, which had been subject to the action of the flames, and was consoling himself for this slight misfortune, by recording uninterruptedly such different vacillations in light and shadow as he chose to consider phenomena. In the meantime the veteran, on whose experience they all so implicitly relied for protection, employed himself in reconnoitring objects in the distance, through the openings which the air occasionally made in the immense bodies of smoke that by this time lay in enormous piles on every part of the plain. "Look you here, lads," the trapper said, after a long and anxious examination. "Your eyes are young, and may prove better than my worthless sight, though the time has been, when a wise and brave people saw reason to think me quick on a look-out. But those times are gone, and many a true and tried friend has passed away with them. Ah's me! If I could choose a change in the orderings of Providence, which I cannot, and which it would be blasphemy to attempt, seeing that all things are governed by a wiser mind than belongs to mortal weakness, but if I were to choose a change, it would be to say, that such as they who have lived long together in friendship and kindness, and who have proved their fitness to go in company, by many acts of suffering and daring in each other's behalf, should be permitted to give up life at such times, as when the death of one leaves the other but little reason to wish to live." "Is it an Indian that you see?" demanded the impatient Middleton. "Red skin or white skin, it is much the same. Friendship and use can tie men as strongly together in the woods as in the towns; ay, and for that matter, stronger. Here are the young warriors of the prairies. Often do they sort themselves in pairs, and set apart their lives for deeds of friendship, and well and truly do they act up to their promises. The death blow to one is commonly mortal to the other. I have been a solitary man much of my time, if he can be called solitary, who has lived for 70 years in the very bosom of nature, and where he could at any instant open his heart to God, without having to strip it of the cares and wickednesses of the settlements. But making that allowance, have I been a solitary man, and yet have I always found that intercourse with my kind was pleasant, and painful to break off, provided that the companion was brave and honest. Brave, because a skeary comrade in the woods," suffering his eyes inadvertently to rest a moment on the person of the abstracted naturalist, "is apt to make a short path long, and honest, inasmuch as craftiness is rather an instinct of the brutes, than a gift becoming the reason of a human man." "But the object that you saw, was it a Sioux?" "What the world of America is coming to, and where the machinations and inventions of its people are to have an end, the Lord He only knows. I have seen in my day the chief who, in this time, has beheld the first Christian that placed his wicked foot in the regions of York. How much has the beauty of the wilderness been deformed in 2 short lives! My own eyes were first opened on the shores of the Eastern Sea, and well do I remember, that I tried the virtues of the first rifle I ever bore, after such a march, from the door of my father to the forest, as a stripling could make between sun and sun, and that without offence to the rights or prejudices of any man who set himself up to be the owner of the beasts of the fields. Nature then lay in its glory along the whole coast, giving a narrow stripe, between the woods and the ocean, to the greediness of the settlers. And where am I now? Had I the wings of an eagle, they would tire before the 10th of the distance, which separates me from that sea, could be passed. And towns and villages, farms and highways, churches and schools, in short, all the inventions and deviltries of man, are spread across the region. I have known the time when a few redskins, shouting along the borders, could set the provinces in a fever, and men were to be armed, and troops were to be called to aid from a distant land, and prayers were said, and the women frightened, and few slept in quiet, because the Iroquois were on the war-path, or the accursed Mingo had the tomahawk in hand. How is it now? The country sends out her ships to foreign lands, to wage their battles. Cannon are plentier than the rifle used to be, and trained soldiers are never wanting, in tens of thousands, when need calls for their services. Such is the difference between a province and a state, my men, and I, miserable and worn out as I seem, have lived to see it all." "That you must have seen many a chopper skimming the cream from the face of the earth, and many a settler getting a very honey of nature, old trapper," said Paul. "No reasonable man can, or for that matter shall doubt. But here is Ellen getting uneasy about the Sioux, and now you have opened your mind so freely concerning these matters, if you will just put us on the line of our flight, the swarm will make another move." "Anan!" I say that Ellen is getting uneasy, and as the smoke is lifting from the plain, it may be prudent to take another flight." "The boy is reasonable. I had forgotten we were in the midst of a raging fire, and the Sioux were around about us, like hungry wolves watching a drove of buffaloes. But when memory is at work in my old brain, on times long past, it is apt to overlook the matters of the day. You say right, my children. It is time to be moving, and now comes the real nicety of our case. It is easy to outwit a furnace, for it is nothing but a raging element, and it is not always difficult to throw a grizzly bear from his scent, for the creature is both enlightened and blinded by his instinct, but to shut the eyes of a waking Teton is a matter of greater judgment, inasmuch as his deviltry is backed by reason." Notwithstanding the old man appeared so conscious of the difficulty of the undertaking, he set about its achievement with great steadiness and alacrity. After completing the examination, which had been interrupted by the melancholy wanderings of his mind, he gave the signal to his companions to mount. The horses, which had continued passive and trembling amid the raging of the fire, received their burdens with a satisfaction so very evident as to furnish a favourable augury of their future industry. The trapper invited the Doctor to take his own steed, declaring his intention to proceed on foot. "I am but little used to journeying with the feet of others," he added, as a reason for the measure, "and my legs are a-weary of doing nothing. Besides, should we light suddenly on an ambushment, which is a thing far from impossible, the horse will be in a better condition for a hard run with one man on his back than with two. As for me, what matters it whether my time is to be a day shorter, or a day longer? Let the Tetons take my scalp, if it be God's pleasure. They will find it covered with grey hairs, and it is beyond the craft of man to cheat me of the knowledge and the experience by which they have been whitened." As no one among the impatient listeners seemed disposed to dispute the arrangement, it was acceded to in silence. The Doctor, though he muttered a few mourning exclamations on behalf of the lost Asinus, was by far too well pleased in finding that his speed was likely to be sustained by 4 legs instead of 2, to be long in complying; and consequently, in a very few moments, the bee-hunter, who was never last to speak on such occasions, vociferously announced that they were ready to proceed. "Now look off yonder to the east," said the old man, as he began to lead the way across the murky and still smoking plain. "Little fear of cold feet in journeying such a path as this, but look you off to the east, and if you see a sheet of shining white, glistening like a plate of beaten silver through the openings of the smoke, why that is water. A noble stream is running thereaway, and I thought I got a glimpse of it a while since, but other thoughts came, and I lost it. It is a broad and swift river, such as the Lord has made many of its fellows in this desert, for here may nature be seen in all its richness, trees alone excepted. Trees, which are to be the 'arth as fruits are to a garden. Without them nothing can be pleasant or thoroughly useful. Now watch all of you with open eyes, for that stripe of glittering water we shall not be safe until it is flowing between our trail and these sharp-sighted Tetons." The latter declaration was enough to ensure a vigilant look-out for the desired stream, on the part of all the trapper's followers. With this object in view, the party proceeded in profound silence, the old man having admonished them of the necessity of caution, as they entered the clouds of smoke, which were rolling like masses of fog along the plain, more particularly over those spots where the fire had encountered occasional pools of stagnant water. They travelled near a league in this manner, without obtaining the desired glimpse of the river. The fire was still raging in the distance, and as the air swept away the first vapour of the conflagration, fresh volumes rolled along the place, limiting the view. At length the old man, who had begun to betray some little uneasiness, which caused his followers to apprehend that even his acute faculties were beginning to be confused in the mazes of the smoke, made a sudden pause, and dropping his rifle to the ground, he stood, apparently musing over some object at his feet. Middleton and the rest rode up to his side, and demanded the reason of the halt. "Lookee here," returned the trapper, pointing to the mutilated carcass of a horse, that lay more than half consumed in a little hollow of the ground. "Here may you see the power of a prairie conflagration. The 'arth is moist, hereaway, and the grass has been taller than usual. This miserable beast has been caught in his bed. You see the bones, the crackling and scorched hide, and the grinning teeth. 1,000 winters could not wither an animal so thoroughly, as the element has done it in a minute." "And this might have been our fate," said Middleton, "had the flames come upon us in our sleep." "Nay, I do not say that, I do not say that. Not but that man will burn as well as tender, but that being more reasoning than a horse, he would better know how to avoid the danger."
"Perhaps this then has been the carcass of an animal, or he too would have fled."
"See you these marks in the damp soil? Here have been his hoofs, and there is a moccasin print, as I am a sinner. The owner of the beast has tried hard to move him from the place, but it is in the instinct of the creature to be faint-hearted and obstinate in a fire."
"It is a well-known fact; but if the animal has had a rider, where is he?"
"Ay, therein lies the mystery," returned the trapper, stooping to examine the signs in the ground with a closer eye. "Yes, yes, it is plain there has been a long struggle atween the two. The master has tried hard to save his beast, and the flames must have been very greedy, or he would have had better success."
"Harkee, old trapper," interrupted Paul, pointing to a little distance where the ground was drier, and the herbage had, in consequence, been less luxuriant. "Just call them 2 horses; yonder lies another."
"The boy is right. Can it be that the Tetons have been caught in their own snares? Such things do happen, and here is an example to all evildoers. Ay, look you here, this is iron. There have been some white inventions about the trappings of the beast. It must be so, it must be so. A party of the knaves have been skirting in the grass after us, while their friends have fired the prairie, and look you at the consequences. They have lost their beast, and happy have they been if their own souls are not now skirting along the path which leads to the Indian heaven."
"They had the same expedient at command as yourself," rejoined Middleton, as the party slowly proceeded, approaching the other carcass, which lay directly on their route.
"I know not that. It is not every savage that carries his steel and flint, or as good a rifle pan as this old friend of mine. It is slow making a fire with 2 sticks, and little time was given to consider or invent just at this spot, as you may see by yon streak of flame, which is flashing along afore the wind, as if it were on a trail of powder. It is not many minutes since the fire had passed hereaway, and it may be well to look at our primings. Not that I would willingly combat the Tetons, God forbid, but if a fight needs be, it is always wise to get the first shot."
"This has been a strange beast, old man," said Paul, who had pulled the bridle, or rather halter, of his steed, over the second carcass, while the rest of the party were already passing, in their eagerness to proceed. "A strange horse do I call it. It had neither head nor hoofs."
"The fire has not been idle,"
returned the trapper, keeping his eyes vigilantly employed in profiting by those glimpses of the horizon, which the whirling smoke offered to his examination.
"It would soon bake you a buffaloe whole, or for that matter powder his hoofs and horns into white ashes. Shame, shame, old Hector! As for the captain's pup, it is to be expected that he would show his want of years, and I may say, I hope, without offence, his want of education too. But for a hound, like you, who have lived so long in the forest afore you came into these plains, it is very disgraceful, Hector, to be showing your teeth and growling at the carcass of a roasted horse, the same as if you were telling your master that you had found the trail of a grizzly bear."
"I tell you, old trapper, this is no horse, neither in hoofs, head, nor hide."
"Anan, not a horse! Your eyes are as good for the bees and for the hollow trees, my lad, but bless me, the boy is right, that I should mistake the hide of a buffaloe, scorched and crumpled as it is, for the carcass of a horse. Ah's me! The time has been, my men, when I would tell you the name of a beast as far as eye could reach, and that too with most of the particulars of colour, age, and sex."
"An inestimable advantage have you then enjoyed, venerable venator," observed the attentive naturalist. "The man who can make these distinctions in a desert is saved the pain of many a weary walk, and often of an enquiry that in its result proves useless. Pray tell me, did your exceeding excellence of vision extend so far as to enable you to decide on the order of, or genus?"
"I know not what you mean by your orders of genius."
"No," interrupted the bee hunter, a little disdainfully for him, when speaking to his aged friend. "Now, old trapper, that is admitting your ignorance of the English language in a way I should not expect from a man of your experience and understanding. By order, our comrade means whether they go in promiscuous droves, like a swarm that is following its queen bee, or in a single file, as you often see the buffaloes trailing each other through a prairie. And as for genius, I'm sure that it is a word well understood, and in everybody's mouth. There is the congressman in our district, and that tonguey little fellow who puts out the paper in our county. They are both so called for their smartness.
which is what the Doctor means, as I take it, seeing that he seldom speaks without some considerable meaning." When Paul finished his very clever explanation, he looked behind him with an expression, which, rightly interpreted, would have said, "You see, though I don't often trouble myself in these matters, I am no fool." Ellen admired Paul for anything but his learning. There was enough in his frank, fearless, and manly character, backed as it was by great personal attraction, to awaken her sympathies without the necessity of prying into his mental attainments. The poor girl reddened like a rose. Her pretty fingers played with the belt, by which she sustained herself on the horse, and she hurriedly observed, as if anxious to direct the attentions of the other listeners from a weakness on which her own thoughts could not bear to dwell. "And this is not a horse, after all?" "It is nothing more nor less than the hide of a buffalo," continued the trapper, who had been no less puzzled by the explanation of Paul than by the language of the Doctor. "The hair is beneath. The fire has run over it, as you see. For being fresh, the flames could take no hold. The beast has not been long killed, and it may be that some of the beef is still hereaway." "Lift the corner of the skin, old trapper," said Paul, with the tone of one who felt as if he had now proved his right to mingle his voice in any council. "If there is a morsel of the hump left, it must be well cooked, and it shall be welcome." The old man laughed heartily at the conceit of his companion. Thrusting his foot beneath the skin, it moved. Then it was suddenly cast aside, and an Indian warrior sprang from its cover to his feet, with an agility that bespoke how urgent he deemed the occasion. Chapter 23. 24 The Prairie by James Fenimore Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Peck. "I would it were bedtime, Hal, and all well." Shakespeare. A second glance sufficed to convince the whole of the startled party that the young Pawnee, whom they had already encountered, again stood before them. Surprise kept both sides mute, and more than a minute was passed in surveying each other, with eyes of astonishment, if not of distrust. The wonder of the young warrior was, however, much more tempered and dignified than that of his Christian acquaintances. While Middleton and Paul felt the tremor, which shook the persons of their dependent companions, thrilling through their own quickened blood, the glowing eye of the Indian rolled from one to another, as if it could never quail before the rudest assaults. His gaze, after making the circuit of every wondering countenance, finally settled in a steady look on the equally immovable features of the trapper. The silence was first broken by Dr. Battius in the ejaculation of "Order, primates; genus, homo; species, prairie." "Ay, the secret is out," said the old trapper, shaking his head, like one who congratulated himself on having mastered the mystery of some knotty difficulty. "The lad has been in the grass for a cover. The fire has come upon him in his sleep, and having lost his horse, he has been driven to save himself under the fresh hide of a buffalo. No bad invention, when powder and flint were wanting to kindle a ring. I warrant me, now, this is a clever youth, and one that it would be safe to journey with. I will speak to him kindly, for anger can at least serve no turn of ours. My brother is welcome again." Using the language which the other understood, "the Tetons have been smoking him, as they would a raccoon." The young Pawnee rolled his eye over the place, as if he were examining the terrific danger from which he had just escaped, but he disdained to betray the smallest emotion at its imminency. His brow contracted as he answered to the remark of the trapper by saying, "A Teton is a dog. When the Pawnee war-whoop is in their ears, the whole nation howls." "It is true. The imps are on our trail, and I am glad to meet a warrior, with the tomahawk in his hand, who does not love them. Will my brother lead my children to his village? If the Sioux follow in our path, my young men shall help him to strike them." The young Pawnee turned his eyes from one to another of the strangers in a keen scrutiny before he saw fit to answer so important an interrogatory. His examination of the males was short, and apparently satisfactory, but his gaze was fastened long and admiringly, as in their former interview, on the surpassing and unwonted beauty of a being so fair and so unknown as Inez. Though his glance wandered for moments from her countenance to the more intelligible and yet extraordinary charms of Ellen, it did not fail to return promptly to the study of a creature who, in the view of his unpractised eye and untutored imagination, was formed with all that perfection, with which the youthful poet is apt to endow the glowing images of his brain. Nothing so fair, so ideal, so every way worthy to reward the courage and self-devotion of a warrior had ever before been encountered on the prairies, and the young brave appeared to be deeply and intuitively sensible to the influence of so rare a model of the loveliness of the sex. Perceiving, however, that his gaze gave uneasiness to the subject of his admiration, he withdrew his eyes, and laying his hand impressively on his chest, he modestly answered— "My father shall be welcome. The young men of my nation shall hunt with his sons. The chiefs shall smoke with the grey head. The Pawnee girls will sing in the ears of his daughters." "And if we meet the Tetons?" demanded the trapper, who wished to understand thoroughly the more important conditions of this new alliance. "The enemy of the Big knives shall feel the blow of the Pawnee." "It is well. Now let my brother and I meet in council, that we may not go on a crooked path, but that our road to his village may be like the flight of the pigeons." The young Pawnee made a significant gesture of assent, and followed the other a little apart, in order to be removed from all danger of interruption from the reckless Paul or the abstracted naturalist. Their conference was short, but, as it was conducted in the sententious manner of the natives, it served to make each of the parties acquainted with all the necessary information of the other. When they rejoined their associates, the old man saw fit to explain a portion of what had passed between them, as follows. I was not mistaken," he said. "This good-looking young warrior, for good-looking and noble-looking he is, though a little horrified perhaps with paint, this good-looking youth, then, tells me he is out on the scout for these very Tetons. His party was not strong enough to strike the devils, who are down from their towns in great numbers, to hunt the buffaloe, and runners have gone to the Pawnee villages for aid. It would seem that this lad is a fearless boy, for he has been hanging on the skirts alone, until, like ourselves, he was driven to the grass for a cover. But he tells me more, my men, and what I am mainly sorry to hear, which is that the cunning Mahtoree, instead of going to blows with the squatter, has become his friend, and that both broods, red and white, are on our heels, and outlying around this very burning plain to circumvent us to our destruction."
"How knows he all this to be true?" demanded Middleton.
"Anan."
"In what manner does he know that these things are so?"
"In what manner? Do you think newspapers and town criers are needed to tell a scout what is doing on the prairies, as they are in the bosom of the States? No gossiping woman who hurries from house to house to spread evil of her neighbour can carry tidings with her tongue so fast as these people will spread their meaning by signs and warnings that they alone understand. 'Tis their learning, and what is better, it is got in the open air, and not within the walls of a school. I tell you, captain, that what he says is true."
"For that matter," said Paul, "I'm ready to swear to it. It is reasonable, and therefore it must be true."
"And well you might, lad, well you might. He furthermore declares that my old eyes for once were true to me, and that the river lies hereaway at about the distance of half a league. You see the fire has done most of its work in that quarter, and our path is clouded in smoke. He also agrees that it is needful to wash our trail in water. Yes, we must put that river between us and the Sioux eyes, and then, by the favour of the Lord, not forgetting our own industry, we may gain the village of the Loups."
"Words will not forward us a foot," said Middleton. "Let us move."
The old man assented, and the party once more prepared to renew its route. The Pawnee threw the skin of the buffaloe over his shoulder, and led the advance, casting many a stolen glance behind him as he proceeded, in order to fix his gaze on the extraordinary, and, to him, unaccountable loveliness of the unconscious Inez. An hour sufficed to bring the fugitives to the bank of the stream, which was one of the 100 rivers that served to conduct, through the mighty arteries of the Missouri and Mississippi, the waters of the vast and still uninhabited region to the ocean. The river was not deep, but its current was troubled and rapid. The flames had scorched the earth to its very margin, and as the warm streams of the fluid mingled, in the cooler air of the morning, with the smoke of the raging conflagration, most of its surface was wrapped in a mantle of moving vapour. The trapper pointed out the circumstance with pleasure, saying, as he assisted Inez to dismount on the margin of the watercourse— The knaves have outwitted themselves. I am far from certain that I should not have fired the prairie, to have got the benefit of this very smoke to hide our movements, had not the heartless imps saved us the trouble. I've known such things done in my day, and done with success. Come, lady, put your tender foot upon the ground, for a fearful time has it been to one of your breeding and skeary qualities. Ah's me! What have I not known the young and the delicate and the virtuous and the modest to undergo, in my time, among the horrifications and circumventions of Indian warfare! Come, it is a short quarter of a mile to the other bank, and then our trail, at least, will be broken."
Paul had by this time assisted Ellen to dismount, and he now stood looking with rueful eyes at the naked banks of the river. Neither tree nor shrub grew along its borders, with the exception of here and there a solitary thicket of low bushes, from among which it would not have been an easy matter to have found a dozen stems of a size sufficient to make an ordinary walking stick. "Harkee, old trapper," the moody-looking bee-hunter exclaimed, "it is very well to talk of the other side of this ripple of a river, or brook, or whatever you may call it, but in my judgment it would be a smart rifle that would throw its lead across it; that is, to any detriment to Indian or deer."
That it would, though I carry a piece here, that has done its work in time of need, at as great a distance."
"And do you mean to shoot Ellen and the captain's lady across, or do you intend them to go, trout fashion, with their mouths under water? Is this river too deep to be forded?" asked Middleton, who, like Paul, began to consider the impossibility of transporting her, whose safety he valued more than his own, to the opposite shore.
"When the mountains above feed it with their torrents, it is, as you see, a swift and powerful stream. Yet have I crossed its sandy bed in my time without wetting a knee. But we have the Sioux horses. I warrant me that the kicking imps will swim like so many deer."
"Old trapper," said Paul, thrusting his fingers into his mop of a head, as was usual with him when any difficulty confounded his philosophy, "I have swam like a fish in my day, and I can do it again, when there is need, nor do I much regard the weather; but I question if you get Nelly to sit a horse, with this water whirling like a mill race before her eyes. Besides, it's manifest the thing is not to be done dry shod."
"Ah, the lad is right. We must to our inventions, therefore, or the river cannot be crossed."
Then, cutting the discourse short, he turned to the Pawnee, and explained to him the difficulty which existed in relation to the women. The young warrior listened gravely, and throwing the buffalo skin from his shoulder, he immediately commenced, assisted by the occasional aid of the understanding old man, the preparations necessary to effect this desirable object. The hide was soon drawn into the shape of an umbrella top, or an inverted parachute, by thongs of deerskin, with which both the labourers were well provided. A few light sticks served to keep the parts from collapsing, or falling in. When this simple and natural expedient was arranged, it was placed on the water, the Indian making a sign that it was ready to receive its freight. Both Inez and Ellen hesitated to trust themselves in a bark of so frail a construction, nor would Middleton or Paul consent that they should do so, until each had assured himself, by actual experiment, that the vessel was capable of sustaining a load much heavier than it was destined to receive. Then, indeed, their scruples were reluctantly overcome, and the skin was made to receive its precious burden.
"Now, leave the Pawnee to be the pilot," said the trapper. "My hand is not so steady as it used to be, but he has limbs like toughened hickory. Leave all to the wisdom of the Pawnee."
The husband and lover could not well do otherwise, and they were fain to become deeply interested, it is true, but passive spectators of this primitive species of faring. The Pawnee selected the beast of Mahtoree from among the 3 horses, with a readiness that proved he was far from being ignorant of the properties of that noble animal, and throwing himself upon its back, he rode into the margin of the river. Thrusting an end of his lance into the hide, he bore the light vessel up against the stream, and giving his steed the rein, they pushed boldly into the current. Middleton and Paul followed, pressing as nigh the bark as prudence would at all warrant. In this manner the young warrior bore his precious cargo to the opposite bank in perfect safety, without the slightest inconvenience to the passengers, and with a steadiness and celerity which proved that both horse and rider were not unused to the operation. When the shore was gained, the young Indian undid his work, threw the skin over his shoulder, placed the sticks under his arm, and returned, without speaking, to transfer the remainder of the party, in a similar manner, to what was very justly considered the safer side of the river.
"Now, friend Doctor," said the old man, when he saw the Indian plunging into the river a second time.
"Do I know there is faith in yonder Red-skin? He is a good-looking, and an honest-looking youth, but the winds of heaven are not more deceitful than these savages, when the devil has fairly beset them. Had the Pawnee been a Teton, or one of them heartless Mingoes, that used to be prowling through the woods of York, a time back, that is, some 60 years agone, we should have seen his back, and not his face turned towards us. My heart had its misgivings when I saw the lad choose the better horse, for it would be as easy to leave us with that beast, as it would be for a nimble pigeon to part company from a flock of noisy and heavy-winged crows. But you see that truth is in the boy, and make a Red-skin once your friend, he is yours so long as you deal honestly by him."
"What may be the distance to the sources of this stream?"
demanded Dr. Battius, whose eyes were rolling over the whirling eddies of the current, with a very portentous expression of doubt.
"At what distance may its secret springs be found?"
"That may be as the weather proves. I warrant me your legs would be a-weary before you had followed its bed into the Rocky Mountains. But then there are seasons when it might be done without wetting a foot."
"And in what particular divisions of the year do these periodical seasons occur?"
"He that passes this spot a few months from this time will find that foaming water course a desert of drifting sand."
The naturalist pondered deeply. Like most others, who are not endowed with a superfluity of physical fortitude, the worthy man had found the danger of passing the river, in so simple a manner, magnifying itself in his eyes so rapidly, as the moment of adventure approached, that he actually contemplated the desperate effort of going round the river, in order to escape the hazard of crossing it. It may not be necessary to dwell on the incredible ingenuity with which terror will at any time prop a tottering argument. The worthy Obed had gone over the whole subject with commendable diligence, and had just arrived at the consoling conclusion, that there was nearly as much glory in discerning the hidden sources of so considerable a stream, as in adding a plant or an insect to the list of the learned, when the Pawnee reached the shore for the second time. The old man took his seat, with the utmost deliberation, in the vessel of skin, so soon as it had already been duly arranged for his reception, and having carefully disposed of Hector between his legs, he beckoned to his companion to occupy the third place. The naturalist placed a foot in the frail vessel, as an elephant will try a bridge, or a horse is often seen to make a similar experiment, before he will trust the whole of his corporal treasure on the dreaded flat, and then withdrew, just as the old man believed he was about to seat himself.
"Venerable venator," he said mournfully, "this is a most unscientific bark. There is an inward monitor, which bids me distrust its security."
"Anan?"
said the old man, who was pinching the ears of the hound, as a father would play with the same member in a favourite child.
"I incline not to this irregular mode of experimenting on fluids. The vessel has neither form nor proportions."
"It is not as handsomely turned as I have seen a canoe in a birchen bark, but comfort may be taken in a wigwam as well as in a palace."
"It is impossible that any vessel constructed on principles so repugnant to science can be safe. This tub, venerable hunter, will never reach the opposite shore in safety."
"You are a witness of what it has done."
"Ay, but it was an anomaly in prosperity. If exceptions were to be taken as rules, in the government of things, the human race would speedily be plunged in the abysses of ignorance. Venerable trapper, this expedient in which you would repose your safety is, in the annals of regular inventions, what a lusus naturae may be termed in the lists of natural history, a monster."
How much longer Dr. Battius might have felt disposed to prolong the discourse, it is difficult to say, for in addition to the powerful personal considerations which induced him to procrastinate an experiment which was certainly not without its dangers, the pride of reason was beginning to sustain him in the discussion. But fortunately for the credit of the old man's forbearance, when the naturalist reached the word with which he terminated his last speech, a sound arose in the air that seemed a sort of supernatural echo to the idea itself. The young Pawnee, who had awaited the termination of the incomprehensible discussion, with grave and characteristic patience, raised his head, and listened to the unknown cry, like a stag, whose mysterious faculties had detected the footsteps of the distant hounds in the gale. The trapper and the doctor were not, however, entirely so uninstructed as to the nature of the extraordinary sounds. The latter recognized in them the well-known voice of his own beast, and he was about to rush up the little bank, which confined the current, with all the longings of strong affection, when Asinus himself galloped into view, at no great distance, urged to the unnatural gait by the impatient and brutal Weucha who bestrode him. The eyes of the Teton and those of the fugitives met. The former raised a long, loud, and piercing yell, in which the notes of exultation were fearfully blended with those of warning. The signal served for a finishing blow to the discussion on the merits of the bark, the Doctor stepping as promptly to the side of the old man, as if a mental mist had been miraculously removed from his eyes. In another instant the steed of the young Pawnee was struggling with the torrent. The utmost strength of the horse was needed to urge the fugitives beyond the flight of arrows that came sailing through the air. At the next moment, the cry of Weucha had brought 50 of his comrades to the shore, but fortunately among them there was not one of rank sufficient to entitle him to the privilege of bearing a fusee. One half the stream, however, was not passed before the form of Mahtoree himself was seen on its bank, and an ineffectual discharge of firearms announced the rage and disappointment of the chief. More than once the trapper had raised his rifle, as if about to try its power on his enemies, but he as often lowered it without firing. The eyes of the Pawnee warrior glared like those of the cougar, at the sight of so many of the hostile tribe, and he answered the impotent effort of their chief by tossing a hand into the air in contempt, and raising the war cry of his nation. The challenge was too taunting to be endured. The Tetons dashed into the stream in a body, and the river became dotted with the dark forms of beasts and riders. There was now a fearful struggle for the friendly bank. As the Dahcotahs advanced with beasts, which had not, like that of the Pawnee, expended their strength in former efforts, and as they moved unencumbered by anything but their riders, the speed of the pursuers greatly outstripped that of the fugitives. The trapper, who clearly comprehended the whole danger of their situation, calmly turned his eyes from the Tetons to his young Indian associate, in order to examine whether the resolution of the latter began to falter, as the former lessened the distance between them. Instead of betraying fear, however, or any of that concern which might so readily have been excited by the peculiarity of his risk, the brow of the young warrior contracted to a look which indicated high and deadly hostility. "Do you greatly value life, friend Doctor?" demanded the old man, with a sort of philosophical calmness, which made the question doubly appalling to his companion. "Not for itself," returned the naturalist, sipping some of the water of the river from the hollow of his hand, in order to clear his husky throat. "Not for itself, but exceedingly, inasmuch as natural history has so deep a stake in my existence, therefore—" "Ay," resumed the other, who mused too deeply to dissect the ideas of the Doctor with his usual sagacity, "'tis in truth the history of nature, and a base and craven feeling it is. Now is life as precious to this young Pawnee as to any governor in the States, and he might save it, or at least stand some chance of saving it, by letting us go down this stream. And yet, you see, he keeps his faith manfully, and like an Indian warrior. For myself, I am old, and willing to take the fortune that the Lord may see fit to give, nor do I conceit that you are of much benefit to mankind. And it is a crying shame, if not a sin, that so fine a youth as this should lose his scalp for two beings so worthless as ourselves. I am therefore disposed, provided that it shall prove agreeable to you, to tell the lad to make the best of his way, and to leave us to the mercy of the Tetons." "I repel the proposition as repugnant to nature, and as treason to science," exclaimed the alarmed naturalist. "Our progress is miraculous, and as this admirable invention moves us so wonderful a facility, a few more minutes will serve to bring us to land." The old man regarded him intently for an instant, and shaking his head, he said, "Lord, what a thing is fear! It transforms the creatures of the world in the craft of man, making that which is ugly, seemly in our eyes, and that which is beautiful, unsightly. Lord, Lord, what a thing is fear!" A termination was, however, put to the discussion by the increasing interest of the chase. The horses of the Dahcotahs had, by this time, gained the middle of the current, and their riders were already filling the air with yells of triumph. At this moment Middleton and Paul, who had led the females to a little thicket, appeared again on the margin of the stream, menacing their enemies with the rifle. "Mount, mount!" shouted the trapper, the instant he beheld them. "Mount and fly, if you value those who lean on you for help. Mount and leave us in the hands of the Lord." "Stoop your head, old trapper," returned the voice of Paul. "Down with ye both into your nest. The Teton devil is in your line. Down with your heads, and make way for a Kentucky bullet." The old man turned his head, and saw that the eager Mahtoree, who preceded his party some distance, had brought himself nearly in a line with the bark and the bee hunter, who stood perfectly ready to execute his hostile threat. Bending his body low, the rifle was discharged, and the swift lead whizzed harmlessly past him on its more distant errand. But the eye of the Teton chief was not less quick and certain than that of his enemy. He threw himself from his horse the moment preceding the report, and sunk into the water. The beast snorted with terror and anguish, throwing half his form out of the river in a desperate plunge. Then he was seen drifting away in the torrent, and dyeing the turbid waters with his blood. The Teton chief soon reappeared on the surface, and understanding the nature of his loss, he swam with vigorous strokes to the nearest of the young men, who relinquished his steed as a matter of course to so renowned a warrior. The incident, however, created a confusion in the whole of the Dahcotah band, who appeared to await the intention of their leader before they renewed their efforts to reach the shore. In the meantime the vessel of skin had reached the land, and the fugitives were once more united on the margin of the river. The savages were now swimming about in indecision, as a flock of pigeons is often seen to hover in confusion after receiving a heavy discharge into its leading column, apparently hesitating on the risk of storming a bank so formidably defended. The well-known precaution of Indian warfare prevailed, and Mahtoree, admonished by his recent adventure, led his warriors back to the shore from which they had come, in order to relieve their beasts, which were already becoming unruly.
"Now mount you with the tender ones, and ride for yonder hillock," said the trapper. "Beyond it you will find another stream, into which you must enter, and turning to the sun, follow its bed for a mile, until you reach a high and sandy plain. There will I meet you. Go, mount. This Pawnee youth and I, and my stout friend the physician, who is a desperate warrior, are men enough to keep the bank, seeing that show and not use is all that is needed."
Middleton and Paul saw no use in wasting their breath in remonstrances against this proposal. Glad to know that their rear was to be covered, even in this imperfect manner, they hastily got their horses in motion, and soon disappeared on the required route. Some 20 or 30 minutes succeeded this movement, before the Tetons on the opposite shore seemed inclined to enter on any new enterprise. Mahtoree was distinctly visible in the midst of his warriors, issuing his mandates and betraying his desire for vengeance, by occasionally shaking an arm in the direction of the fugitives. But no step was taken which appeared to threaten any further act of immediate hostility. At length a yell arose among the savages, which announced the occurrence of some fresh event. Then Ishmael and his sluggish sons were seen in the distance, and soon the whole of the united force moved down to the very limits of the stream. The squatter proceeded to examine the position of his enemies, with his usual coolness, and, as if to try the power of his rifle, he sent a bullet among them, with a force sufficient to do execution, even at the distance at which he stood.
"Now let us depart,"
exclaimed Obed, endeavouring to catch a furtive glimpse of the lead, which he fancied was whizzing at his very ear.
"We have maintained the bank in a gallant manner for a sufficient length of time. Quite as much military skill is to be displayed in a retreat as in an advance."
The old man cast a look behind him, and seeing that the equestrians had reached the cover of the hill, he made no objections to the proposal. The remaining horse was given to the Doctor, with instructions to pursue the course just taken by Middleton and Paul. When the naturalist was mounted, and in full retreat, the trapper and the young Pawnee stole from the spot in such a manner as to leave their enemies some time in doubt as to their movements. Instead, however, of proceeding across the plain towards the hill, a route on which they must have been in open view, they took a shorter path, covered by the formation of the ground, and intersected the little watercourse at the point where Middleton had been directed to leave it, and just in season to join his party. The Doctor had used so much diligence in the retreat as to have already overtaken his friends, and of course all the fugitives were again assembled. The trapper now looked about him for some convenient spot, where the whole party might halt, as he expressed it, for some 5 or 6 hours.
"Halt!"
exclaimed the Doctor, when the alarming proposal reached his ears.
"Venerable hunter, it would seem that on the contrary many days should be passed in industrious flight."
Middleton and Paul were both of this opinion, and each in his particular manner expressed as much. The old man heard them with patience, but shook his head like one who was unconvinced, and then answered all their arguments in one general and positive reply.
"Why should we fly?" he asked. "Can the legs of mortal men outstrip the speed of horses? Do you think the Tetons will lie down and sleep, or will they cross the water and nose for our trail? Thanks be to the Lord, we have washed it well in this stream, and if we leave the place with discretion and wisdom, we may yet throw them off its track. But a prairie is not a wood. There a man may journey long, caring for nothing but the prints his moccasin leaves, whereas in these open plains a runner, placed on yonder hill, for instance, could see far on every side of him, like a hovering hawk looking down on his prey. No, no, night must come, and darkness be upon us, afore we leave this spot. But listen to the words of the Pawnee. He is a lad of spirit, and I warrant me many is the hard race that he has run with the Sioux bands. Does my brother think our trail is long enough?" he demanded in the Indian tongue. "Is a Teton a fish, that he can see it in the river?" "But my young men think that we should stretch it until it reaches across the prairie." "Mahtoree has eyes; he will see it." "What does my brother counsel?" The young warrior studied the heavens a moment, and appeared to hesitate. He mused some time with himself, and then he replied like one whose opinion was fixed. "The Dahcotahs are not asleep," he said. "We must lie in the grass." "Ah, the lad is of my mind," said the old man, briefly explaining the opinion of his companion to his white friends. Middleton was obliged to acquiesce, and, as it was confessedly dangerous to remain upon their feet, each one set about assisting in the means to be adopted for their security. Inez and Ellen were quickly bestowed beneath the warm and not uncomfortable shelter of the buffalo skins, which formed a thick covering, and tall grass was drawn over the place, in such manner as to evade the examination from a common eye. Paul and the Pawnee fettered the beast, and cast him to the earth, where, after supplying them with food, they were also left concealed in the fog of the prairie. No time was lost when these several arrangements were completed, before each of the others sought a place of rest and concealment, and then the plain appeared again deserted to its solitude. The old man had advised his companions of the absolute necessity of their continuing for hours in this concealment. All their hopes of escape depended on the success of the artifice. If they might elude the cunning of their pursuers by this simple and therefore less suspected expedient, they could renew their flight as the evening approached, and, by changing their course, the chance of final success would be greatly increased. Influenced by these momentous considerations, the whole party lay, musing on their situation, until thoughts grew weary, and sleep finally settled on all, one after the other. The deepest silence had prevailed for hours, when the quick ears of the trapper and the Pawnee were startled by a faint cry of surprise from Inez. Springing to their feet like men who were about to struggle for their lives, they found the vast plain, the rolling swells, the little hillock, and the scattered thickets, covered alike in one white, dazzling sheet of snow. "The Lord have mercy on ye all!" exclaimed the old man, regarding the prospect with a rueful eye. "Now, Pawnee, do I know the reason why you studied the clouds so closely? But it is too late. It is too late. A squirrel would leave his trail on this light coating of the 'arth. Ha! There comes the imps to a certainty. Down with ye all! Down with ye! Your chance is but small, and yet it must not be wilfully cast away." The whole party was instantly concealed again, though many an anxious and stolen glance was directed through the tops of the grass on the movements of their enemies. At the distance of a half-mile, the Teton band was seen riding in a circuit, which was gradually contracting itself, and evidently closing upon the very spot where the fugitives lay. There was but little difficulty in solving the mystery of this movement. The snow had fallen in time to assure them that those they sought were in their rear, and they were now employed, with the unwearied perseverance and patience of Indian warriors, in circling the certain boundaries of their place of concealment. Each minute added to the jeopardy of the fugitives. Paul and Middleton deliberately prepared their rifles, and as the occupied Mahtoree came, at length, within 50 feet of them, keeping his eyes riveted on the grass through which he rode, they levelled them together and pulled the triggers. The effort was answered by the mere snapping of the locks. "Enough," said the old man, rising with dignity. "I have cast away the priming, for certain death would follow your rashness. Now let us meet our fates like men. Cringing and complaining find no favour in Indian eyes." His appearance was greeted by a yell that spread far and wide over the plain, and in a moment 100 savages were seen riding madly to the spot. Mahtoree received his prisoners with great self-restraint, though a single gleam of fierce joy broke through his clouded brow, and the heart of Middleton grew cold as he caught the expression of that eye, which the chief turned on the nearly insensible but still lovely Inez. The exultation of receiving the white captives was so great,
as for the time to throw the dark and immovable form of their young Indian companion entirely out of view. He stood apart, disdaining to turn an eye on his enemies, as motionless as if he were frozen in that attitude of dignity and composure. But when a little time had passed, even this secondary object attracted the attention of the Tetons. Then it was that the trapper first learned, by the shout of triumph, and the long-drawn yell of delight, which burst at once from 100 throats, as well as by the terrible name, which filled the air, that his youthful friend was no other than the redoubtable and hitherto invincible warrior, Hard Heart. Chapter 24.